Do you think this is going to become an insult throwing shouting match? Because I feel like there's a chance that since, you know, there's only two of them, there's a chance for it to be more productive, like the Ben conversation. But if Glenn isn't willing to answer their questions directly, then it could quickly become Destiny trying to hold him down on something, Glenn getting frustrated, and then it becomes like a shouting match. But I'm hoping that it doesn't become that. But there's a good chance it does. And if it does, I'm just going to embrace it fully.
Between author and journalist Glenn Greenwald versus live streamer and political commentator Destiny, we're going to be debating about whether January 6th was an insurrection and Trump's role in it. So let's get started and lay some ground for the rest of the debate. Was what happened on January 6th an insurrection? And within your answer, can you define what an insurrection is? Glenn, can you start, and then we'll go to Destiny.
God, that's such a hard one too, because coup, it's easier. Because someone could argue, and I've heard Destiny say this before, that it was Trump's attempts to subverting democracy that was the attempted coup. But what happened on January 6th was more of an insurrection. It's harder that it's specifically insurrection and not coup. It's gonna be harder for Glenn, that is.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we started there, because I do feel like we spent in that last debate a lot of time on the question of whether this was a coup or whether this was an insurrection. And I feel like these are more political terms of art than terms of science that have a concrete definition, which is one of the reasons why I think it's not only justifiable but actually necessary to look at how these terms have been applied historically and in other contexts, not as a way of distracting from January 6th, but precisely to see whether or not the attempt to apply those terms to January 6th is consistent with how these terms are generally used, or whether it's just kind of a partisan attempt to create a narrative that serves the Democratic Party.
Okay, I'm just going to pause this quick. I'm sorry, we're going to pause a lot probably today. I just want to throw out there that I've heard Euromaidan described as a coup 1,000,000 times over. And if that is described as a coup, even though we know what Yanukovych did was going against the wishes of people. We know that the Yanukovych has a history of anti-democratic policies. He was trying to ban protests. He was going against the rights of the people. Like, that's still regularly called a coup or an insurrection. And so my question would be, and this is what I want Destiny to ask, and I know I'm focusing on Ukraine again, I'm always focusing on Ukraine, but if this is the standard that journalists like Glenn have used to call what happened in Ukraine a coup or an insurrection, at the very least a coup, words usually used as coup, then how can we not apply that same standard here? The only difference would be is that, you know, they failed, and it wasn't based on like the death of a bunch of people or the brutality towards protesters. It was based in fabrication, a fairy tale, the idea that Trump had the election stolen from him.
So for me, I guess you kind of have to look at coup and insurrection a little bit differently. A coup is when some faction in society, either the faction that is already in power or the faction that is not in power but wants to be in power, mount some very credible and serious attempt, almost always using force or the threat of force, people who are a militia or the...
Why does it have to be credible or serious? Can't someone have like a failed coup or a failed push? Like the beer hall push failed. Is it like how much of a joke does it have to be? Like if we found out that Rudy Giuliani tried to take over the country with a bunch of Proud Boys with squirt guns, like legitimately tried to do something stupid, it's not like that. You could still say that was an attempted coup. It would just be the dumbest coup in human history.
Military in order to seize power illegitimately outside of the legal structure, using violence or the threat of violence in order to do so. An insurrection just simply, I think, implies that there's a faction domestically that has launched a serious rebellion, a serious attempt to seize power in that country, again, using extrajudicial, extra legal means that in almost all cases involves either the use of force or the threat of force. You may be able to imagine a situation where the use of force or the threat of force is not necessary for an insurrection, but I think it's extremely difficult to imagine such a case. But
he's only using I think he's using the word serious specifically because the standard that he just laid out could apply to people on J6. There were people on J6 trying to overturn the results of the election. In fact, that was the whole purpose of the protest. It was Stop the Steal. That was the name of the event. They tried to storm the Capitol because they genuinely thought democracy was dying. At least a lot of them did. And if you really think that, it's not that crazy that you would take power into your own hands. I think the reason he keeps introducing the word serious, or like it has to be serious, is because then he can just like kind of laugh off the silly January 6th rioters.
In general, that's how the terms are used.
I'm assuming intention here, which I don't like to do, but that's the vibe I'm getting.
And then you have these kind of subsidiary terms that are very new, that are kind of retreats from those terms, like legislative coup or soft coup, that, as I said, is a way to kind of put it into the general category of coup and insurrection without actually calling it one. And that typically...
If it's a soft coup, it's still a coup. Like, if I got into a fender bender, that's still a car accident, even if I don't want to call it like a car accident. If I think that word is too significant, it's still a car accident, whether or not it's a mild car accident.
Involves the illegitimate use of a legal process or some other means that's still extrajudicial, contrary to the law, without actually using force or the threat of force to achieve those ends.
What about faking votes?
What about what?
What about faking votes? Would that be counted?
I'm sorry.
If you tried to fake votes, would that be counted as an insurrection? Or
Okay. Eli is bringing this up because this is in reference to Trump's fake slate of electors, which what the Trump campaign and Trump people around him tried to do is, since they lost the election, they were trying to get, and each state like has electors that go to the Capitol and like elect the president, and they're supposed to choose the people their district voted for. At least that's the idea. And what they tried to do is push an alternative slate of electors. So not so necessarily they could say choose those electors over that electors, but just make enough electors and throw out enough electors to cause confusion and make it so that Vice President Mike Pence or somebody can be like, oh my gosh, this is so crazy. Look at all these other electors. Now this is in doubt. Who's the president? I don't know. Let's send it back to the states. The majority of the states being controlled by Republican House majorities. And you can see the plot that's boiling up here, but it doesn't have to do with who actually won the election. It's creating confusion around who is the elector and then taking advantage of the confusion to try to get Trump in office. So that's Glenn Greenwald said it doesn't always have to be forceful. So under this definition, could not be attempted coup, even if you wanted to use the word like soft coup or like legal coup, paperwork coup, whatever you wanted to call it.
Just force, really.
To fake votes?
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to try and steal an election using fraud, I don't really think that's the sort of thing that we have in the past described as either an insurrection or a coup. That's just more stealing an election. And that's why I think it's so important to distinguish between actually when force is actually involved or invoked or the threat of violence is invoked, precisely because there are so many other ways to seize power illegitimately that fall short of being a coup or insurrection. That's actually a good example of one, which would be fabricating votes or throwing away valid votes or fabricating invalid votes as a means of winning an election illegitimately.
Destiny, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to almost run with Glenn's definition here, because I think January 6th pretty squarely and easily falls within that. But I guess the two definitions I would offer up are the Colorado Supreme Court. They concluded that an insurrection, as used in Section 3, is 1, a public use of force or a threat of force, 2, by a group of people, and 3, in order to hinder or prevent the execution of the Constitution of the United States. In Paulson and Bott's paper, they go over broader definitions, but they more or less say the same thing in more words. I mean, we can read from them, and they would say that insurrection is best understood as concerted, forcible resistance to the authority of government to execute the laws in at least some significant respect. So I would say that like an insurrection is probably more than being upset at a police officer and saying like, no, I'm not going to, get a ticket and running away. Probably has to involve a group of people who are making a concerted effort to like resist the good faith execution of law from the federal government in this case. And I think January 6th.
Sorry, I was muted. I don't know if the good faith factor really matters there, but I mean, that definition isn't bad.
With Trump's plan to circumvent the electoral process with false electors, the actual day of events where Trump gives a huge speech, he sends a whole bunch of people down to the Capitol, ostensibly to protest the certification of the vote, where the people at the Capitol engage in violence in order to prevent Congress from certifying the vote. And then when the people at the Capitol engaged in violence succeeded in preventing the certification of the vote for some number of hours and then were finally cleared away, I would say that whatever we call an insurrection or whatever definition we use, all of the events here are bullseye like an insurrection.
So can I ask a question, Eli? I don't want to usurp your role. I don't know how you want to conduct it, but...
Yeah. I mean, I feel like Glenn kind of spoiled himself at the start here, but because even under his definition, it can count as an insurrection. He just threw in words like serious and seriously. Like, I think to try to divert from that. But all Destiny would need to do is focus on that and say, how serious is it when 100 officers get injured? When does it become serious, and why does that element matter? And I think like the conversation honestly could basically be over then. It's like a 2-hour talk. It'll go on longer, but I mean, from the start here, Destiny's in a good position.
However you want it, like to just ask kind of a follow-up question to that. The question I have for you then, Destiny, is there any requirement that it actually poses a credible or a serious threat to succeed in its...
Again, serious is such a subjective word. Like, serious in what? I would say that people storming the Capitol building and actually delaying the vote makes it clearly serious, because that is not something that happens every day. That is a serious situation when Congress people have to evacuate and put on gas masks because people storming the Capitol chanting, hang this politician, hang that politician, where's this politician, where's that one? They were scared for their lives on the run. I would say that is serious enough to get a lot of people serious time in prison, some over a decade.
Same. So, for example, let's imagine that Donald Trump wins the election in November, as most polls predict that he will, at least as of now. And let's say that you have 1 or 2 people inside the U.S. government who are kind of career civil servants who view Trump as such a great threat to all things decent in the United States, and they go to the Capitol and they're armed with knives and they stand outside and they say, we have knives and we demand that Donald Trump be removed from the White House and the Congress vote to impeach him immediately and reinstall Joe Biden because
that would be an insurrection. Certainly.
We think he's the legitimate president. Would that, in the history books, is something that you would then call a coup or an attempted coup or an insurrection?
If like 100 people with knives tried to go to the Capitol building and threaten politicians to say, install our guy or we will stab, and then maybe they even, if we're trying to compare this January 6th, they start stabbing. Yeah, I would call that an insurrection. It probably wouldn't get anywhere, but it would be an insurrection. Yeah.
I mean, you might call it one, but I think it would be so minor, and it would be so silly that I don't know if we would necessarily refer to it as such.
If we wanted to compare it to Jan 6, people would need to get injured. Some people could die as a result of the day's events. Police officers would need to open fire in order to protect. There's so many more elements you would need to add in order to make it exactly equivalent. But in the basic terms that even Glenn laid out, you could probably fit it in there.
Instance, like we could concoct a conspiracy to murder thing where I make a plan that's so ridiculous with another person that we're going to go and buy, I guess snow, and we're going to pour it down somebody's roof until it all melts and the person drowns and dies. I'm like, and we actually go and buy the stuff and we go to the house and take steps towards the crime, but it's such a silly crime. I don't know if you'd call it that. I'm sure we could find cases like really far away on the peripheral, on the edge, but with January 6th, I think we're in a bullseye definition of whatever we would call insurrection or attempted coup or rebellion.
So I think the reason why I asked that is, I think actually the extent of the threat, like the credibility or the gravity of the threat, is absolutely critical to whether or not in any other instance we would be calling something like this a coup or an attempted coup. Because if you look at January 6th, although you did have more than 2 people doing the sort of thing that I just...
Here's the question. That attempted coup in Turkey during Erdogan's time in power, do you guys think, despite any theories around it, which I even think, since it failed, does it not count? Or how serious would it have had to been? Like, how close to success? Or since they were soldiers, now it immediately is okay? Do the soldiers have to be in uniform? Could there be soldiers not in uniform? Because many people at the Capitol that day were soldiers out in uniform, or cops not in uniform, or former. Many of them were militiamen. I mean, I just, man, it doesn't seem to be any like red line here, and it's all up to personal interpretation.
Described, and I asked a ridiculous example to try and understand whether you would at least concede that it requires some kind of significant...
Oh, that's a good question from chat. Was the 40 senators killing Caesar an insurrection? That's a good question.
Or quantitatively impressive attempt to actually seize control from the legal means of...
I mean, my answer would be yes, by the way. I mean, it's a crowd of people.
Of power. What you had on January 6th is a hodgepodge of people, which, according to the federal government itself, had only a small minority of people who actually used violence of any kind. There's only something like 10% or 8%, depending on how you counted the number of people charged, who are even accused of having used violence at all. And it's a pretty broad definition for using violence, like anyone who got near any attempt to hit a police officer or to push a police officer aside got put in that violent category. So I'm at a very small number of people. And then on top of that, not a single person during this entire 3-hour riot actually pulled out an arm, let alone discharged an arm. The only arm that was discharged was one that was used against the people who were protesting. And then it basically...
Hey, if you look at the attempt to take over Hungary and Budapest by the rebels in 1955, 1956, the majority of protest, I mean, I would have to go back. If I could find out that like 51, 52, 3% of the people who protested that day didn't fight with cops, they were just out there, you know, holding signs. And during revolutions, during times of struggle where people are sharing their opinions, most people don't grab guns and shoot. A lot of other people just go out and express their opinions and make their voice heard. So would that not count if the majority of them didn't engage in violence?
I liked Destiny whenever I dislike his debate opponent more lol.
Would, if there was one guy, like, is it because they don't have guns? Like, if we gave like 2 J6ers guns and they opened fire but immediately got capped, would it then be an insurrection?
They got subdued in 3 hours, not with any kind of real force, pretty easily. I mean, it was pretty easily subdued in a very short period of time. And I don't...
Again, it did actually violate the process. And just because it was crushed quickly doesn't mean it couldn't have still been an insurrection. In fact, I would say the fact that the government, after, you know, everybody was realizing what was going on, wanted to stamp it out and was eager to stamp it out because of what it was. I think from their perspective, oh, this is a questioning of American government's authority. This is a question of the central government. This is a direct attack on the American center of power. And that's how it was talked about at the time. They were treating it like it was a serious threat. I mean, the people at the Capitol treated it like a serious threat. Ashley Babbitt certainly was treated like a serious threat.
I think anybody would argue, and I'm interested in whether you would, that this ever got near a serious threat to remove or topple the most powerful and militarized government ever to exist on the planet? I mean, do you think it even got close to a serious threat to do that?
So just as a quick thing, going through all of these points, there's a whole bunch of things that's used to talk about January 6th that I feel like doesn't want to engage with the facts of what happened. And most of these points are just not relevant. So hodgepodge of people, it was a collection of Donald Trump supporters that had been called there weeks or months in advance by Donald Trump. All of these people showed up to his ellipse speech. A lot of them did. All of them marched to the Capitol, all chanting the same things with the clear goal of protesting the certification of the vote. That's why they were saying things like 1776, which we all recognize was a rebellion against Great Britain. It wasn't a hodgepodge of people. It was a collection of people that were all there for an incredibly specific purpose. I think it would be unbelievable for me to ever accept the idea that it just randomly happened that those people happened to be gathered, that were all supporting the same candidate, that was saying that Congress shouldn't certify the vote, that was trying to get Pence not to certify the vote, that these people happened to go down to the Capitol.
Which, by the way, Pence didn't have the authority to do.
They happened to engage in violence. They happened to succeed in delaying the certification of the vote. All of this happened randomly from a hodgepodge of people that were subdued in 3 hours, whether they were subdued, whether they discharged an arm. And to say that they weren't a serious threat is also crazy, given that there were times where these people were literally rooms away from other lawmakers. I think it's more incredible to say that it never was a serious threat. Like you yourself say that only a small percentage engaged in violence. What if that percentage instead of 10% was 15%? What if instead of 15 it was 20 or 25%?
This is the thing. If we're talking about a crowd of like, let's just say 100,000 people. Right? I don't remember the exact number. They say 1 million. It wasn't 100. Some people say 1 million. 100,000 people. If just 20%, that means 1 in 5. The vast majority don't engage in violence. That's still 20,000 rioters. I think some people don't take that into perspective.
Who's to say what could have possibly happened afterwards, other than the fact that thankfully, retrospectively, we can look and see that it didn't get to that. But I mean, this was some tens of thousands of people that were many engaged in violent protests that were breaking into the Capitol and managed to delay the certification.
How many people are you saying were at the Capitol on January 6th?
I don't know. I've seen everything from 100,000 plus to some people say it was 50 to 70,000. I don't know what the exact number is.
Who entered the Capitol?
No, not who entered. Who were there protesting outside.
Oh, how many entered? How many entered?
Was it? The numbers I saw were anywhere from 1 to 2,000.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So imagine
So-
if 5,000 would have entered or 10,000, right? Who's to say that there couldn't have been a
Yeah,
threat?
so just on pushing on Destiny's point, Glenn, at what point would you call that an insurrection, or what point would you?
Like, does an insurrection have to have the risk of success in order to be an insurrection? That sounds a little weird. I don't know why that would be the case. A battle plan is still a battle plan, even if it's hopeless. The defense of Berlin was still a battle plan for defense, even if there was no chance of success.
You said 6-7%. Well, violent. Is there a certain percentage that it needs to hit, or?
Well, I mean, Destiny himself acknowledged in the very first question I asked him that there's a quantitative component to this for sure, which is why nobody would seriously call two people with knives gathering outside the Capitol.
Sorry, in YouTube chat, I see the real Vladimir Putin just said, Comrade Trumpy is my best friend. So, I just want to confirm that the liberals were right about Russiagate. Proven right here on the Dylan Burns TV channel, right in my YouTube chat. Breaking news over here.
Even though they're proclaiming an insurrectionary intention or objective, nobody would say in history that that would be referred to as the United States having survived a coup or a coup attempt or an insurrection, because it was just far too insignificant. And I don't think that there is like, as I said, I don't think it's a term of science, these terms like insurrection and coup. I think they're like a lot of the terms that we use in our political vernacular, like terrorism and hate speech or disinformation. That really has no fixed meaning. It all kind of depends on who gets to apply the term and for what purpose. Is a group using violence a revolutionary group fighting against corruption? Are they trying to topple the government?
How do we distinguish a crowd that's, a crowd that's rioting because of, like, oh, a cop ended up killing a local unarmed person, and the locals are not happy about it, and there's like a small riot at a mall against some cops, right? How do we distinguish that between we're storming the United States Capitol building in order to make our candidate win because we want power? There has to be a way to distinguish these two things. And by using the word insurrection, that's how largely liberals have been able to distinguish these two. And I do think that it needs to be distinguished. If the goals are different, what these people are trying to attain is different, and if we don't acknowledge that openly, then it's going to be hard to try to plan for those types of scenarios for a future event like Jan 6, or in order to, like, deal with the disinformation that led to people thinking that the election was actually stolen and storming the Capitol, which we just throw out there we haven't properly dealt with because the majority of the Republican Party still believes that the election was stolen.
Government and therefore terrorists.
The belief system that led to people charging the Capitol that day are still held by the Republican Party as a whole and the majority.
All these terms are very kind of shifting because they're points of propaganda. But what I think is that in order to make a serious case that this is a historic event, I mean, I think one of the Krasenstein brothers began by comparing it to Pearl Harbor or 9/11 and the Civil War, kind of invoking those kinds of events. Democrats have done that as well. I don't hold Destiny to that, but clearly there's a belief, I think, that this is like a major event in United States history. And for me, the reason it wasn't is because it never did get anywhere near the number that would be required to pose a significant threat to the power of the United States government. I don't think you can set a quantitative number. You can ask whether, and I think the kind of people who are there is so important. And that, I mean, Destiny dismissed the idea that it was a hodgepodge, trying to say that we're all homogenized.
I mean, you could make the argument if you wanted that an insurrection happened in the Capitol, but an insurrection didn't necessarily happen in the crowd. Like, a lot of times I hear the argument, I haven't heard this yet from Glenn, that it has to be like a pre-constructed plan. And there were people in the crowd that day that did have that, but I don't even think that's necessary. I don't think that's a lot of people get high in crowds. I don't know if you've ever been in an angry crowd before, but it's like getting high. Okay. It's kind of hard to describe it, but it really has an effect on you. You can get really caught up in it very easy. And that's how a lot of revolutions, protest movements, insurrections start. Spontaneously in an angry crowd because the government has just gone a little too far. And in this case, for those at the Capitol building that day, the stealing of the vote was just that little too far.
Even the U.S. government admits they were wildly disparate people, both in terms of why they were there and what they intended. That's why a few of them got charged with sedition, and then others got charged with misdemeanors, and then some people got charged with felonies, even though they weren't accused of violence.
Then couldn't you say that again, the people who got charged with sedition and those trying to stop the certification of the vote by charging the building, they were the insurrectionists, but not necessarily everybody there was the insurrectionist.
That they had extraordinarily different intentions. This was not, for example, like, I think you can look at a event that kind of comes closer to what would be required to call it a coup, which was the rebellion by the Wagner Group in Russia, where you're talking about an extremely well-trained militia, a well-armed militia of 25,000 soldiers that had the capability to shoot Russian military aircraft from the sky, and they did. They took down 6 helicopters and a military jet. But even there, the Russian state, nowhere near as powerful as the U.S. state, distracted by the war in Afghanistan, crushed it in 12 hours. Like, in the context of Russian history, that is not even like a footnote in terms of like a real threat to the power of the Russian state. And yet, that at least had real numbers, 25,000 who were real soldiers. Most of the people who were at this Trump rally, remember the 4 who died on January 6th, 2 of them died of a heart attack. 1 died of a speed overdose.
I mean, I could have but the problem is, though, I wonder if we had like the Russian Glenn Greenwald and they were talking about the Wagner coup, I don't even know if you can call it a coup, because again, the intention there, what was the intention of the whatever, but you could certainly call it an insurrection. You have to call it insurrection. But I wonder if there was any like Russian Glenn Greenwald who said like, but wait, well, Lukashenko negotiated with Prigozhin and he turned around. And what coup and what revolution, what insurrection do they turn around? Are they so easily talked down? Obviously this is, we can call this maybe like a disturbance or use some other clinical word to try to water it down. I wonder, it just seems like we're bending ourselves so much not to use the word.
These are people who are not even fit, let alone well-trained soldiers, at least the majority of them. And so when you're talking about people who really did anything like that, you're talking about a very small number.
Yeah, so there's, again, I find this is, I feel like it's going to be a theme here. The obfuscation and then the misdirection and everything, I just don't think any of this is relevant. Nobody thought that the Whiskey Rebellion or the Whiskey Insurrection was going to destroy the entire U.S. government, right? There's a few hundred farmers that were upset over, you know, taxes and alcohol. But like, why do we think that the insurrection, the rebellion needs a significant chance to succeed in order to be called an insurrection or rebellion? That's just historically, you keep saying historically.
It can be a lost cause and be an insurrection. I don't know why this is crucial.
Historically, that's never been the case. It's never been the case that we've had to establish that it would have never been the case, for instance, if only one state seceded and they had no realistic chance of winning in the Civil War, that we would say, oh, well, they weren't insurrectionists or rebellionists because they were never going to win. So on that ground of like, they have to have a realistic shot at winning, I just don't think that's just not grounds ever for an insurrection or to declare something insurrection or rebellion. It's just a way to minimize the events that actually happened because they happened to not be successful. When we talk about how...
If it's a joke, then if it's a joke, it should be treated as such.
But
again, you can laugh at a stupid insurrection. Like somebody can do it. For example, you guys remember, I don't know if you guys remember this, invasion of Venezuela. Okay, this thing, Operation Gideon, this thing was a mess. We don't know how deep this is and actually related to the United States government. There was a U.S. private security firm, Silvercorp USA, that tried to infiltrate Venezuela and overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro. The idea was that all the economic pressures, all the other problems that Venezuela's going through, that if they just drop a few boys on the coastline, and they've done it with very little funding, it was a very terrible, piss-poor operation, that they would be able to overthrow the regime. Didn't work, didn't succeed, failed, and it became a massive, massive, massive joke. Literally, no one died. Wait, no, that's not true. 6 of the insurrectionists got killed, and 92 others were captured, including 2 mercenaries. I mean, again, look at this. Venezuela Intelligence Agency, Associated Press had prior knowledge. Commentators and observers described the operation as amateurish, underfunded, poorly organized, impossible, and a suicide mission. A suicide mission. And this is all true. It was a complete joke, and I laugh at it to this day because it was a fucking mess. I don't know if this was a Trump idea. I know Trump talked about invading Venezuela and toppling the regime. I don't know if he gave them some signals to go ahead with it, but then he gave them the funds. Trump has been known to leave people high and dry. We don't know what happened here. But what we do know what happened here is an attempted overthrow of Nicolas Maduro. This was an attempted coup, overthrow, invasion, whatever you want to call it. And whether or not it was pathetic does not affect the fact that it was. You can laugh at it, you can call it a joke, you can call it whatever you want, but it's still an attempt to overthrow Nicolas Maduro. If that's the case, then could we not call this a coup? And if we found anything that was as embarrassing as this, would we not call it a coup or an invasion? Like when Idi Amin invaded neighboring countries to distract from his internal issues, whether or not that invasion was poorly organized does not considered an invasion.
It was
like
a joke. Historic event.
It was a historic
that
event.
Threatened the United States government.
It did threaten the U.S. government. It was a historic event. What other time in U.S. history has the certification of the vote been delayed?
Another great example from site chat. Bay of Pigs. Was that not considered an invasion? Would that not be considered an attempted coup? Would that not be considered? Again, this seems like an asterisk made specifically so he can walk back from his conclusion that this isn't considered an insurrection. I agree vaguely with the idea that the word insurrection, like many other words, has become kind of so vague and used so, and to so many people it means so many different things. It's very hard to use it when talking about this topic. But I think that's largely in part due to the obfuscation around this topic.
The certification, we've had so many official proceedings of Congress, including things like confirming Supreme Court justices, delayed because people went to Capitol Hill, entered Capitol Hill, occupied Capitol Hill, and protested the proceedings, and ended up delaying the proceedings. There have been proceedings to vote on wars, where anti-war protesters have disrupted. So all the time we've had people entering the Capitol, protesting congressional proceedings, and never are the ones who don't use violence accused of felonies, let alone anything resembling the kinds of charges that the January 6th defendants faced, because the ideology, the ideological component here is what made this to be something so much bigger than in fact what it was.
I'm going to ask.
That's assuming a lot there. I'll let Destiny speak, but then I'll give my thought.
I'm going to ask the same question again. When in the history of the United States has the certification of the electoral vote, the peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next, been delayed by protesters?
By the way, if it's not a question of ideology, like these are conservatives, so they're cracking down hard, or these are liberals, so they're cracking down hard, I can be blunt with you that the FBI has gone after leftist organizations for decades. It's not a question of these are conservatives, so we hate them.
Flemmy gifted 3 Tier 1 subscriptions. A few months German security forces uncovered and stoked a Maoist coup in the planning stages.
Oh
Why did
yeah,
people
that's another one. I
furiously
forgot
defend
about
Jan
that.
6?
Oh my gosh. Remember those monarchists in Germany? They were insane. They wanted to bring this prince to the throne in Germany. They wanted to overthrow democracy. I forgot their names. If somebody can remind me the name of their movement, they were insane. Thank you so much for the gifted tier 3 subs. Attempted monarchist coup in Germany. Yeah, here it is. On December 7th, members of a suspended far-right terror group were arrested for allegedly planning a coup in Germany. The group, called Patriotic Union, was led by a council, was part of the far-right, the Reichsbürger movement. Basically, they believed that after World War II, Germany was occupied and that the current German government is illegitimate, and the last legitimate government was the German Reich. And therefore, they're kind of like sovereign citizens, but German and also Nazis, basically. Well, they're not all inherently Nazis, but they're Nazis, monarchists, or of that stripe. Anyway, they raided all the homes. They found all these bombs and guns and weapons. They were legitimately organizing to try to overthrow the government and put Heinrich Prince Rus, or as we all know him, the true leader of Germany, was going to be brought to the throne. Oh my gosh. Also, there was a former Alternative for Germany MP, which is the far-right German party that's getting a lot of popularity right now, was involved. Now, that's a joke. The idea that they're going to bring this random prince or who's it, what's it, royal, whose archaic worldview is going to be hoisted to the throne, and everybody knowing no clue who this guy is going to accept it. It was a joke. It was never going to succeed. It didn't have a hope of succeeding. Maybe it could cause some instability. Maybe there'd be some usefulness for a foreign government to try to, hype these guys up in order to just try to cause instability, to try to make Germany focus on internal issues over external issues. I know the Russians have been funneling funds and resources to the far right and assisting them for a very long time, in part for this purpose. But even if it's a joke, still an attempted coup. You can't just say, because if Hitler wore a clown nose while doing the beer hall push, it would still be the beer hall push.
Or violent protesters.
I'm happy to concede that this is the first time that people went on January 6th.
Then it's historical. Then it's historical.
And interrupted the proceeding.
Yeah, then it's historical, right? By definition, it's a moment in history that is unique.
It wasn't a serious disruption.
They delayed the vote, didn't they?
By 3 hours or by.
Okay, how long would it have to be? This is a great question for Glenn. Would it have to be a day? Would it have to be a week? Would people have to hold the Capitol building and like embarrass the United States for a month, trying to stop Joe Biden from getting put in? It feels like it's just, I don't want it to be where we don't call it an insurrection. We don't call it as we see it until, okay, now that they've taken over, we can call it a coup. You know, I just don't want to ever live in that society where we're just going to be crossing our arms. And I see a lot of people on Twitter accepting the nothing ever happens mentality. Like, if you just always bet on nothing ever happening, you'll usually be right. And I understand the mentality, and I kind of agree to it to a purpose, but if to a point. But if you have that mentality, then you're just not going to be vigilant. And as your democracy is taken from you, you're just going to be sitting on the sidelines. And democracy isn't just this, this thing that is and will always will be. And it's the natural end goal, because all the environmental factors naturally push the good-natured human beings towards democracy. It is an institution made up of people who are imperfect, that just like all other institutions can be corrupted, enter decision atrophy, and collapse as people feel in danger or fearful, or demagogues try to take advantage of it. And so I don't want to live in a world where we're sleeping and waiting for the crisis to come and just thinking, oh, don't worry about it. Then it comes and we weren't ready. I don't want to be a frog boiling in water, I think is the expression. Fail expression, but most common one. Way to get my point across.
4 hours.
For the first time in U.S. history. Yes, that's significant. That's serious.
Why is it more significant to delay?
Oh yeah, beer hall push only lasted a day. That is true.
This proceeding than other congressional proceedings. Things like voting on wars or confirming Supreme Court justices are pretty serious too, in terms of the things Congress is supposed to do under Article 1. But the reason we don't consider those protests, even though they might have delayed the proceedings some, to be historic or serious or an insurrection, is because they never posed a threat to the stability of the United States government. In order to have an actual insurrection of the kind that...
By the way, I do think January 6th provokes a threat against the United States government, and will provoke an even bigger threat if Trump gets reelected and he starts pardoning all these. While I'm not a huge punitive policy guy when it comes to law enforcement, like you need to punish them and take their nose and rub it in the shit in order to, I'm not big on that. I do believe that there has to be a deterrence from people committing these crimes. And if Donald Trump gets elected, and after those people all storm the Capitol with the purpose of overthrowing the government, overthrowing the process to keep their guy in office because they couldn't accept him losing, if they get rewarded for that behavior, what signal does that send? Not only is there a lack of trust in the institution that was damaged on January 6th, and our institutions only have as much power as we give them, and then part of giving them power and giving them strength and giving them stability is believing in those trusting those institutions, and not trusting them to be perfect, but trusting them to be better than any individual personality in managing the country.
You want to claim this is, you would need enormous numbers of very well-trained people who are heavily armed with serious plans to go into the Capitol and overthrow the power of the United States government. This is the kind of drama queen behavior that has dominated the Trump years, where every kind of event is catastrophized to its highest extent.
So you would say that any past, so like the Whiskey Rebellion in the United States, that's stupid. They shouldn't have called it.
Subscriptions. Sorry for Dono spam winking face. Last month, 27 coopsters were charged with high treason. Minimum punishment is 10 years in the slammer.
Nah, it wasn't serious. It wasn't. Thank you for the 5 gift to tier 1 subs. And those lawyers are pretty cool and everything. They probably went to schools where they study the laws or whatever. You know, how many there might be. I mean, there's a lot of laws. So there's a lot there might be a whole 200 laws or something. So, they've got a lot to study. But I think, no. How about no? How about they didn't shoot anyone?
called it that. They should have called it like the farmer protest or something different, or because
I don't even
what you're
the-
saying
I-
right now, it stands in contrast to how every other person viewed insurrectionism or insurrectionists at the time when, say, the 14th Amendment was drafted and ratified. People viewed people sometimes as being insurrectionary or giving aid or comfort to enemies of the United States just for letting their children go off to war to serve the Confederacy. It's nice if you, Glenn Greenwald, personally have some view of what you personally think an insurrectionist or rebellion might look like or what it should be, but to be quite frank, your opinion doesn't really matter. The opinion would be the historical relevance of the saying in the United States. It would be the historical analysis that exists for historical rebellions or insurrections in the United States, which oftentimes had very little to no chance of succeeding. Even the insurrectionists themselves thought that they weren't going to succeed.
We do like overthrowing stuff here. We certainly do. And if you don't give us foreign governments to play with, we'll play with our own.
And we would use that analysis that exists at the time when, say, the 14th Amendment was ratified, and then we would use that going forward to figure out what do we think an insurrection and a rebellion is. And again, you can try to minimize and you can try to call it ideological and whatever you want. None of those congressional protests that you mentioned in the past rose to a level where tens of thousands of protesters were violently breaking into Congress and delaying the certification of the presidential vote.
You just got done saying that the maximum number of people who entered the Capitol was 2,000, and now you're.
By the way, the people involved in the coup in Germany, which everyone calls a coup, or the attempted coup, it was like 27 people were like.
Calling it tens of thousands of people because you know so well. In fact, you conceded in the very first question I asked you that of course there has to be a quantitative component in terms of the
Wouldn't it be much easier for Glenn to be like, yeah, it's an insurrection, but it was a pathetic insurrection? It would be so much easier, I think, to argue like, yeah, it's an insurrection in the same way it was a coup, like those German fools were a coup, but you don't see people in Germany whining about those fools 2 years later. That would be an easier argument to make, I think, from his perspective, but whatever.
Of the threat in order to seriously call it an insurrection or a coup, which is why I began by asking you whether or not if two people armed with knives went to the Congress and demanded that Donald Trump be removed after he was declared the winner and threatened to use violence with their knives, whether that would in the history books or by our major newspapers be referred to as the United States fighting off a coup or an insurrection.
Dude, are you telling me that the New York Post wouldn't love to call it like the kitchen knife coup or the kitchen knife insurrection or the kitchen knife revolt? They wouldn't love to put that headline on a newspaper and put it on every doorstop in America. Of course they would.
Insurrection. And you said, yeah, I mean, I guess if it's just two people.
Are you telling me if a bunch of Biden supporters did that is not what the front cover of Newsmax and the New York Post and Fox News would be?
Then it would probably be pretty ridiculous to call it that. So I see this, what happened on January 6th, a 3-hour riot that even the FBI's informants on the ground told the FBI in real time was never intended to be any kind of premeditated violent act on the part of most people, but instead was something that happened spontaneously, as so often happens where political protests confront the police and become violent. I see it much more akin to the kind of ridiculous example that I began by asking you, where you conceded that wouldn't be called an insurrection, than I do some kind of Civil War type situation or even a meaningful armed rebellion of the kind that happened in Russia last year, where even that was crushed in 12 hours.
Are you familiar with Loki's wager?
Explain it to me.
So I think Loki makes a wager with two dwarves or whatever, and eventually they say that they can cut his head off. It comes to the point to where he loses the wager. They go to collect their bet, and when they're trying to figure out how to cut his head off, they're arguing over what part of the neck is when the head starts, and then the rest of the neck begins, basically. And the argument he eventually makes is, well, you can't take even a centimeter, an inch of my neck, therefore you're not allowed to cut my head off. You're trying to argue right now that because I might not consider two people an insurrection, that I can't possibly consider 2,000 people an insurrection. That's the same as you saying, since I can't tell precisely where your head ends and your neck begins, I might say that your toe is part of your head. This argument is nonsense, and the only way that you can make the argument is to continue to try to make comparisons to other more extreme coups or more intense insurrectionist attempts, which I agree.
Dude, I need to learn more like Greek mythology and stuff to like bring into my bring up into my debate, man. It'd be great, like in the middle of like an economy debate. It's like, do you know the story of the time Athena was torn apart by 12 wolves? That's what the Social Security conversation reminds me of. It would be fun. It'd be fun.
Can be more extreme insurrectionist attempts. There can be more extreme coups. But the reality is, even if you want to wind it all the way back down, even if you want it all the way back down, say like, okay, we'll ignore the tens of thousands of protesters outside. We can just go with 2,000 people. Glenn, how are you seriously going to argue that 2,000
Greek, whatever, you get the idea. Everything in the ancient world is Greek. That's how it works. That's how it works because that's what I saw on the History Channel.
people inside the Capitol with the goal of delaying the certification of the vote, which they accomplished, doesn't represent an insurrection.
Wait, so Glenn, just before you go on, I just want to put you on Glenn's question. So Glenn's question was, he said, an insurrection when there's an actual threat to democracy. I'm pushing off that a vote isn't a threat to democracy. At what point did you call it an would you call it an insurrection on January 6th?
I don't know, like, here's the thing. I don't know the thin line that they'd have to cross to call it an insurrection, but whatever line that is, it was crossed a long time ago. You had the President of the United States calling up over 100,000 people to D.C., and then he riled them up saying that they needed to essentially delay the vote. He was relying on Pence to do it. All of those protesters went to the White House. A lot of them, or not to the White House, sorry, to the Capitol building. A lot of them broke into the Capitol building with the goal of delaying the certification of the vote because they didn't like the outcome of the election and they wanted to change it. They needed to fight like hell to take their country back because Mike Pence wasn't going to do the right.
In my mind, once there were people in the Capitol building trying to stop the certification of the vote, that purpose, usurping the system, once that happened, at that point, it was an insurrection. Like, once they were scuffling with, like, outside cops or whatever, like, you could say, you know, it's arguable motives or what was going on. But once you got in there and you see them trying to get to the legislators, I think at that point, it's insurrection.
Thing by helping Trump do his constitutional coup, and so they turned it into an insurrection. It's plainly what happened. Now, if only 20 people went in, would I consider it an insurrection? I don't know. Maybe not. If only 100 people went in, maybe. Maybe if 200 people went in and they got further, maybe. I'm not sure where exactly I would slice the pie to call it.
Yeah, here's like an interesting question. Let's say only 5 people got in, but instead of they delayed it for 3 hours, they delayed it for 10 because they had AR-15s. That then be an insurrection? Or if they were all capped by like a hero cop, would it just be so silly that it wouldn't count anymore?
Whatever we call it, but wherever we're at, we're way over that. And I just don't think the comparisons to other more extreme coups or more extreme rebellions or anything in Russia, it just doesn't make any sense. It's only done to equivocate on what's actually happened or to do a whataboutism to something that I would probably plainly agree with. Like, wouldn't you agree this is a more serious coup or more serious insurrection? Yeah, sure, there can be more serious coups and more serious insurrections. Much the same that there could be more brutal murders of one person and another. It doesn't make one murder not a murder just because you did it easier or did it cleaner.
Okay, so first of all, the reason, as I said,
by the way, like like assault and how this, I don't know if you ever seen somebody like on Twitch or like live streamers or people who are really big attention whores claim assault online before during live stream. I'm trying to think of how to properly describe this, but sometimes when people are like having a confrontation, especially when other people are watching, or there's law enforcement that are vaguely around, or there's cameras involved, they'll get in each other's face, they start yelling, and then one person touches the other, right? Now, who knows how they touch this? I think one of the greatest examples would be that piano player recently that got harassed by this Chinese TV stars, and then like while they were talking, his hand touched her flag, and then they started freaking out like, that's assault, that's assault. Now, at a certain point, like where it becomes assault, where it doesn't become assault, like somebody getting shoved, is how serious of assault is that? Somebody having a water bottle thrown at them or like spit at, these are all things that can be called assault. Now you can say, yeah, it's assault, but getting spit at is obviously very different than somebody beating you over the head with like a skateboard, right? But this is assault. So I think you could still, again, the easier argument for Glenn Greenwald to make, in my opinion, is January 6th is a coup in the same way that an insurrection is somebody getting shoved. The same way assault is somebody getting shoved. The same way assault. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. I fumble on my words so much that sometimes I assume I fumbled on my words. And then by assuming I fumbled on my words and going to correct my words, I then fumble on my words anyway. Anyway, let's continue.
To start, why historical comparisons or historic comparisons to other incidents are so important is because there's a gigantic ideological and partisan motive here and exaggerating the extent to which what happened on January 6th was a serious threat. And especially when somebody is a Democratic Party partisan who goes around saying the Democratic Party is better, we want people to go and vote for Democrats, we want to make sure Donald Trump doesn't return to power, and at the same time the narrative they're pushing coincidentally aligns perfectly with their partisan agenda, then I think it's important to start questioning whether or not there's any authenticity to the beliefs based on how other situations have previously been treated. So let me just make 2 points here about what Donald Trump did. You're actually allowed to summon people to Washington to protest. It's one of the most important rights that the Constitution guarantees. The president is completely free to call his supporters to Washington and to tell them and argue for them that some injustice has been committed and that they ought to protest in response to it. There was one time, and only one time, when Donald Trump addressed the question of whether or not violence should be used when those people went to the Capitol. And what he said was this, quote, "I know that everybody here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." And the fact that people, because he said peacefully, then have to resort to things like, oh, well, he invoked political cliches like fight like hell. Politicians use fight like hell in almost every speech. Joe Biden, you can read this in the New York Times on December.
I have no idea if Trump intended for that crowd to get violent that night. What I do know is this, that he riled them up, pumped them full of lies that any freedom-loving people, if they truly believed, would probably make them violent. If someone believes, yeah, our democracy is dead, it's stolen, and we're about to have a communist dictatorship take over the country. If you believe that, and you have the seat of power right there, it's not hard to imagine how somebody could convince themselves that in defense of their democracy, in defense of their forefathers who fought for freedom, they're going to fight for freedom today. They're going to storm the Capitol. And so I would say that whether or not he directly ordered them to do that, he pumped them full of the information, full of the lies that made them want to do that. Also, once there was time to do something, he waited and waited and waited to the point that his own kids were arguing with each other and yelling and like angry that he wouldn't do anything. And they were saying, this looks bad, this looks awful. This also led to, I think, Tucker dropping Trump for a little period of time. At the time, everybody could clearly see Trump was kind of like crossing his arms and just watching everything unfurl. And all the accounts we get back is, yeah, he was just watching on the news, everything unfurl. And even live tweeted it in some instances. Before eventually, hours after the fact, calling people to stop rioting at the Capitol, after Ashley Babbitt had already been capped, after tons of cops had already been injured, after the certification of the vote had already been delayed.
Second said, quote, "I want to make sure we're going to be fighting like hell." You can find pretty much every politician saying that. So that's one thing, is that to the extent you want to say that Donald Trump was somehow involved in this quote-unquote insurrection, the only thing he did was give a constitutionally protected speech, and that is the reason why Jack Smith has not charged him with inciting or participating in an insurrection. It's not my opinion. Obviously, Jack Smith shares the opinion that he could never obtain a conviction. The second thing is, on the numbers, 2,000 people, let's use the maximum number, went into the Capitol. A small percentage, a tiny percentage of people who went into the Capitol actually used violence. So most of those people, the vast majority, according to the US government themselves, were doing nothing other than peacefully protesting.
Have you ever, after the Ukrainian government was overthrown in 2014, and I think for good reason. This is the thing about coups. Coups can be for good reason, and coups can be for bad reason. I think a coup or an overthrow or a revolution is how I would describe it. It's called the revolution of dignity for a reason. Over a government that's murdering you, trying to ban protest. It's not hard to figure out why people were upset. After that was done, people went into Yanukovych's mansion. Can we actually... I remember somebody told me once, like, Dylan, you make everything about Ukraine. And I'm very sorry if I do. I try not to, but it's my knowledge, and I care about it deeply. Yanukovych mansion. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it, but after it, like, people were able to just freely go in. Look at this. And guess what? The majority of them were not violent.
Where
Here we are. Well, they have guns now. I don't know. I just don't think that the majority of people being violent is a necessary factor.
Again, protesters entering the Capitol without authorization, occupying offices of members of Congress in order to pressure them to take some step or not take some step is something that happens all the time. We've seen many more than 2,000 protesters. So don't try and imply that on January 6th, 2,000 armed people or well-trained people intending to commit violence went into the Capitol. The most of that number that you could possibly squeeze out of it is something like 100 or 150, and now we're back way closer to the most ridiculous example that I began by asking you about, where even you said, oh, that probably shouldn't be called an insurrection, than we are to an actual threat to American power or to our system of government, which is necessary to claim in order to turn this into what you want to turn it into.
Okay, just before I respond to this, so then do you think then that the Whiskey Rebellion or the Whiskey Insurrection, was that not a rebellion or insurrection then in your eyes?
Great question.
People
thing is
rebelling
wait, I'm sorry,
against
wait,
things that
say that
they-
again?
I'm just gonna throw out there. I have a feeling he's not. Is he gonna answer this question? Because I feel like if he answers this question,
I think
or is the key element gonna be guns? Maybe.
Rebellion. I think it's a rebellion. I don't think I would call it an insurrection. I think it's perfectly fine to call it a rebellion.
What? Okay. Huh?
Rebellion. I would have to look a lot more into the facts of exactly what happened with the Whiskey Rebellion. I haven't thought about that question before, but I think the word rebellion is vague enough that any kind of protest could be called a rebellion. I mean, people who are protesting and interrupting political...
I'm sorry, I don't know how anyone could come to the conclusion that the Whiskey Rebellion was a rebellion, but then it wasn't an insurrection. How? If it's a rebellion, it has to be an insurrection. They were saying the authority of the government is shit. They're taxing us. Us farmers are being treated like garbage. You know, we did this whole American Revolution for us. We don't want a king here or over there. And then they, did the whole thing. They did their whole rebellion, their insurrection, challenging the authority of the government, challenging the authority of the state to tax them, and then picking up arms to reject it. How is that not an insurrection? Again, it feels like he's walking back from his conclusion.
events and going to the White House and banging on the fence against...
It's like, dude, that wasn't murder. He killed him. No, that wasn't... He didn't kill him. He murdered him.
The war in Israel and the U.S. support for it are rebelling against U.S. policy. I don't have a problem with that term.
Okay.
But I have to look a lot more closely at the Whiskey Rebellion to be able to say definitively
That's fine.
whether
Okay.
I regard that.
If you want to make these arguments that any protest can be called a coup or rebellion, you're free to make that argument. But you have to understand that you are using it in an ahistorical way that no legal scholar...
Watching you for a while and I respect what you do. Here's a hundo.
Wow, a hundo. My goodness. I will accept the hundo. So Rabadabadabad. What a name. Rabababarub. What a name. Goodness. Thank you so much for the 100 buccarinos. My goodness. You know, we're still demonetized on the channel. We're still demonetized on YouTube. We're finally unbanned from Twitch. So at least we have Twitch back. But we're still demonetized, and it looks like it's going to be in total 7 months when it's all said and done. So any support like that is always greatly appreciated. And that's the only way we can keep the channel afloat. With the documentary filmmaking costs, the travel costs, the cost of paying 2 editors. Really thankful. So, I mean, I'm very thankful. Thank you very much.
Any protest can be called a coup or rebellion. You're free to make that argument, but you have to understand that you are using it in an ahistorical way that no legal scholar, that nobody...
If anybody else wants to donate, DylanBurns.tv. But again, thanks for the hundo.
Who's passed laws in Congress that refers to an insurrection or rebellion. Literally nobody in the legislative or historical context in the United States has used rebellion or insurrection to mean protest. That has just never been the case. It is
That's
entirely...
not my argument at all.
What?
That's not my argument. That's not my argument at all. My argument is that what happened on January 6th was a protest.
That's fine, but I'm saying that what you just said, any 2 people knocking on a fence might be considered a rebellion or insurrection. That can be your assessment, or that the Whiskey Rebellion was a rebellion but not an insurrection. That might be your assessment, but at the time...
Ellen, the Whiskey Rebellion involved the OG Revolution veterans. The comparison January 6th is... No, I'm not saying they're the same thing. Okay, my point was that I don't understand how you could say that the Whiskey Rebellion was a rebellion but not an insurrection. I think, quite frankly, this is him finding out like, oh, well, this would, all these instances do count as an insurrection, but if I call that an insurrection, then I might have to call this an insurrection, and I don't want to because I don't like the politicization that's associated with it. Therefore, I'm now going to say all these things that are clearly insurrections. Maybe they're not. I don't know. Maybe it's subjective. The Whiskey Rebellion was an insurrection. There's no historian that's going to disagree with the idea that the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't an insurrection. Bunch of people with guns saying, screw the government, you can't tax me. I don't know what... There's not a more America-style insurrection than, I'm not going to pay them taxes. It was an insurrection.
It was known as the Whiskey Insurrection, which was around the time when people were drafting the 14th Amendment. So I would think that their understanding of what an insurrection was at the time is probably a more important analysis than what your personal subjective and convenient interpretation of what an insurrection might be right now.
Now you're just ranting. I mean, this claim that like everyone who was ever involved in the lawmaking process.
This isn't ranting. He made a point. I don't know if Glenn just can't listen. Look, I love historical arguments. I love appealing to historians because I believe everybody got to believe in something. If there's anything I believe in or an institution I trust more than other institutions, it is historians. That's not to say that I accept every historian says at face value, but when it comes to like classes of people or like technical groups, experts, I respect historians immensely.
Or the legislative process sees the term as you do. We can agree, just like to set this fact straight, that Jack Smith, who charged Donald Trump with many crimes, including crimes that were considered quite aggressive from a prosecutorial perspective, like he was not a overly cautious prosecutor, but a quite aggressive one who stretched a lot of theories to accuse him of certain felonies. He chose not to accuse Donald Trump of a crime that is in the U.S. Code, which is participating in or inciting an insurrection. You agree that that's not part of what Jack Smith charged Donald
I agree
Trump
that
with,
Jack
right?
Smith hadn't charged him with that, but whether or not somebody did something isn't relevant
Why
to
not?
a particular
Why not?
criminal charge.
Do you have
Well, I mean, there's two reasons. Well, one is because
all members of the lawmakers are on your side. Why didn't he?
Well, because one, if we're talking about, for instance, the 14th Amendment, a criminal conviction isn't relevant here. We don't need a criminal conviction for the...
No, I'm asking you why Jack Smith. I'm not talking about the banning from the ballot. That'll be a U.S. Supreme Court decision, and the courts have thus far split on that question. Democratic judges in Colorado, and then secretaries of state in California and Rhode Island, both have taken the opposite position. I'm not asking you about whether he should be stricken from the ballot or you need a criminal conviction. I'm asking you why did Jack Smith, an extremely aggressive prosecutor in these cases, not charge Donald Trump with inciting or participating in an insurrection?
It could be for a variety of reasons.
By the way, let me just say, whether or not he could get Trump for insurrection doesn't mean an insurrection didn't occur that day. Trump could not be able to be charged with anything directly related to an insurrection that day, and an insurrection still could be involved. For example, somebody could have been deeply involved with the Whiskey Rebellion, but they couldn't get any charges on him, or he was like putting out verbal words of support and like encouraging them to go to the place where they ended up doing the insurrection. But if they don't have any evidence, the court does not just bet on the idea that you could be guilty, so we're gonna throw the book at you. It's gonna be, unless we can prove without a shadow of a doubt of your criminal guilt to put you behind bars, then you're free to go. So the court probably looked at it, said there's not enough evidence to bring anything against Trump. There's enough evidence to bring against these people who charge a capital of sedition and give them over a decade behind bars, but not enough for Trump. But that, in and of itself, I don't think really has much to do with whether an insurrection occurred here, because an insurrection could occur separate from whether Trump was directly involved in that insurrection, even if he was indirectly involved.
Could be that's a question.
Give me some. Do you have an idea?
Well, I was about to, but then you cut me off. Yeah. It could be that he feels like he doesn't have enough strength to secure a conviction for insurrection. It could be that if you actually read the statute...
No one can accuse me of pre-watching. This is live.
For insurrection, even the criminal statute itself is like kind of vague because it uses insurrection like in the statute of insurrection. It doesn't really give much guidance as to what it is. Nobody in the history of the United States has ever been charged with that particular crime. And it could just be that he felt like there was an easier prosecutorial path to go. You're not seriously you're not of the contention right now that if somebody isn't charged with a particular crime, nobody thought they did it, right? You don't think that prosecutors just think that we're going to charge you with everything we think you did, right? You understand that when people are charging crimes, they're charging...
None of those people on Epstein Island did anything. How many charges have been brought against this, that, this, and this guest of Epstein Island?
what they think they can get a conviction on, yeah?
Yes, having worked in the legal profession as a lawyer for more than a decade, I do actually understand that sometimes prosecutors opt not to charge people with crimes, even though they may think they're guilty. What I'm saying is this specific case of a prosecutor who has demonstrated an eagerness to be extremely aggressive in the charging documents, including bringing crimes that many legal experts, including ones who aren't pro-Trump, believe is quite a stretch and will be very difficult to prove in court, opted not to charge Donald Trump with.
Be clear, the only reason we're in the legal discussion right now is because Glenn Greenwald could not toss with the historical discussion. Because from a historical angle, his definition of insurrection just does not work. Now, that doesn't mean language hasn't changed over time, and maybe something's changed since then. But it seemed like he wasn't even able to tango with it. So now that's the only reason we're in this topic. And I just wanted to state that openly, so it was on the record. So I would acknowledge it. Hopefully you guys would see it as well. That the historical argument and the historical discussion I thought would have been the most interesting and most prevalent in the easiest way to try to figure this out, because we can go back and see, like, while partisan political divides have always affected how we talk about events like the Whiskey Rebellion, it could give us some, framework to base our discussion off of. And instead, now we're discussing, well, what was Trump himself charged with it? That doesn't, again, an insurrection could have happened without anyone being, actually. That doesn't, now that would be very unlikely, but the charging element doesn't really matter in proving if it happened or not.
With participating in or inciting an insurrection. I think your answer is actually correct, that he believes it would be.
Now, obviously, if you got a conviction on Trump for insurrection, it would be much easier to make your case. But the case is not dependent on Trump being arrested or Trump himself.
Very difficult to prove that what took place on January 6th was an insurrection and or that Trump participated in or incited it. And I think it's an extremely important point. It is not dispositive. Maybe Jack Smith had suddenly some kind of secret motive that made him not do that. But everything we know about Jack Smith and what he was doing in these cases, I think leads us to at least acknowledge that that's pretty relevant. That not only Jack Smith, in fact, no prosecutor, despite being very aggressive and wanting to convict Donald Trump of crimes, chose to accuse him of that crime. And I do think it's worth asking, why not? If Donald Trump actually incited an insurrection, as you believe, I would hope that the prosecutor would charge him with that crime. But I agree with Jack Smith's decision not to, because I think it would be very close to impossible to prove that that was an insurrection that he participated in or incited. So if all these legal theorists and legal scholars that you're so well acquainted with unanimously agree with your view, why wouldn't Jack Smith do that? Are you angry Jack Smith didn't charge him with that?
I would want Jack Smith.
I do not know of any legal scholar that Destiny has brought up that said Trump should have been charged and convicted with insurrection long enough. I don't remember Destiny making that claim, or I have no clue where this is coming from.
These legal theorists and legal scholars that you're so well acquainted with unanimously agree with your view. Why wouldn't Jack Smith do that? Are you angry Jack Smith didn't charge him with that?
I would want Jack Smith to pursue, it's a federal court, so I'd want him to pursue whatever charges he thinks he can get Trump the most on, not just any particular thing that he thinks he might have done. There might be a number of political reasons why he decided not to go the insurrection charge route, least of all the fact that it would be the first time a criminal charge like this has ever been attempted to be used in the entire history of the United States, and also because it might actually call into question too much, what is First Amendment speech versus not, and trying to convict a former president or something like that might be a really hairy political question that the federal courts, for whatever reason, feel like they just don't want to get involved in. So they went on what they felt were more solid legal grounds that wouldn't put them, in the eyes of the American public right during an election that would force them to have to answer essentially an incredibly difficult political question regarding protected speech, which is why I like the route that Jack Smith went, where he's going after, I think, much cleaner legal questions relating to obvious matters of obstruction that are cleaner and simpler than trying to define, what is insurrection when the statute itself doesn't even necessarily call it out. But again, to recenter, this idea that because he didn't charge for a particular crime, we can't say that J6 wasn't an insurrection.
God, man, the recentering, I completely forgot, man. I would have stopped right there. I got to get better at that. And I think people online need to get better at that. Make sure to recenter the conversation when something isn't settled. Because debating online is pivot central. Pivot central. It's people constantly trying to jostle and pivot into areas that they feel like they're more comfortable. And anytime somebody who deeply cares about their image, and I would keep Glenn in there, I would keep Destiny in there too, in a conversation that isn't just like two friends shooting the shit to be productive, they're going to pivot out immediately. They're going to pivot out as soon as they can into an area that's going to make them feel much more comfortable. They feel like they know much more about.
insurrection just, again, doesn't make sense when no one has ever been charged with insurrection in the United States. I think we all agree that the Civil War was at the very least an insurrection, if not a full-on rebellion. Nobody was charged after the Civil War with
It was both.
insurrection as a crime. It doesn't mean we don't think that they weren't insurrectionists, right?
Right, for political reasons. But in the case of Jack Smith, and I want to let this go because my argument is not that it's dispositive. My argument is that it's rather relevant. Now, let me ask you this question. This is something I was really trying to pursue in the last debate. I don't think we ever got to have a dialogue on it. So I just
By the way, this is much more productive than the other conversation. And this is more productive than I thought it was going to be, even if there's still like some amount of jostling and pivoting. It's still much more productive than that other discussion.
Return to it, which is the following.
Even if there's pivoting and a lot of trying to obfuscate.
If Donald Trump, let's assume that you are right, that Donald Trump had an intention to incite a coup or an insurrection in the United States, that he was hell-bent on breaking the law in order to cling to political power, there were all sorts of things that he not only could have done, but that typically people trying to perpetrate coups in almost every case do. Namely, right up until the time that he peacefully walked out of the White House on January 20th before noon, which is the time when the peaceful transition of power occurs, Trump was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He was the head of the executive branch, which means under his command, he had the entire U.S. military, all sorts of agencies that are very well armed and very trained, and all of whom are duty-bound to obey his orders. Maybe some of them would have...
His argument's not gonna be, if he really wanted to insurrection, why didn't he just order the army to take over everything? Because number one, you can make the argument that they were actually, quite frankly, thinking about that. Remember the executive order that was written up to seize all the voting machines? So, I mean, even if you wanted to play on those grounds, we could play on those grounds. But just because Trump was smart enough to know that ordering Mark Milley to overthrow the government would get a no, we can't do that. We don't have the authority to do that. We won't do that. We know Mark Milley wouldn't agree to that. The Joint Chiefs of Staffs, the military establishment probably wouldn't agree to that. He probably didn't do it because even though Trump has, he's not the best decision maker. He's smart enough to know that that wouldn't have worked. And so he tried other alternatives. That's why they wrote up the executive order about using the National Guard to seize voting machines. That's why he did the fake slate of electors. That's why he tried to call the Secretary of State of Georgia and tried to intimidate him to find the votes to make him win, and then listed the exact number of votes that he needed to find that just so happened to be the exact amount of votes that he was behind by in the race against Biden in Georgia. I
refused, but probably a lot of them would have obeyed. A lot of them were probably on his side. We heard for years how there were all these...
I don't know. I mean, a lot of them would have made. There's probably some in the rank and file, but do we really know of any high-ranking military officers that would have joined Trump on this journey to overthrow the government? For what? For no evidence he was able to provide? So it would quite literally be Trump loyalists in the military saying, with no evidence, because we believe Trump, we're going to overthrow it. Yeah, I don't think it would have worked. I don't think it would have worked. And hey, since it wouldn't have worked, and since it would have been silly and a joke, then would it have been counted as an insurrection under Glenn Greenwald's terms?
Fascist and white supremacist factions within these military units. Why do you think that if Donald Trump wanted to perpetrate a coup, he didn't do...
By the way, even if there's like 1 in every 10 soldier is like a white nationalist, which I doubt the number's that high, even if that was the case, and every single one of those were like, we love Trump, that's still not enough to overthrow the government, to deal with the other 9 out of 10 people.
What almost every other person capable of this who perpetrated the coup has done, which is order the military or these other armed agencies to surround the White House, keep anybody who tried to come and get him out, and ensure that he remains in power using violence or other illegitimate and illegal means. Like, why didn't he even try that?
You're asking me why Donald Trump didn't order the military when he already thought Milley was literally a treasonous actor for not giving him all the information that he thought he was entitled to for military guns. You're asking me why he didn't ask the military to help him when he already disagreed with so many members of the military. You're asking why he didn't ask the intelligence services to help him, that he had said since the start of his presidency were engaged in Russia collusion hoax, and with Peter Strzok and his text messages, and with the Hunter Biden laptop that were all set against him. You're asking me the question of why didn't Donald Trump order the very parts of his government that he thought were backstabbing the most to help him?
I feel like I know this is a live stream, but I feel like I pre-watched it spiritually because we're a lot of this we're on the same page.
Ensure his coup? Is that what, just to be clear, that's the question you're asking me?
Yeah, and I'll tell
Okay,
you
the
why I'm
answer
asking,
why is because he didn't have any of these people on his side and he knew it. That's why he fired people like Comey. That's why he tried to intimidate and bully every other part of his administration that wouldn't follow him, whether it was Jeff Sessions when he served as temporary attorney general, whether it was his own trying to undermine his own attorney general Barr when he turned against him, whether it was trying to undermine literally every other part of his government that turned against him. Like, Donald Trump didn't have any friends anywhere. The idea that he wouldn't turn to, other members of the government to help him, like the military or the Secret Service agencies, or not the intelligence agencies, is not only is it like, well, why didn't he do it? Well, it's obvious why he wouldn't do it. It's because he didn't think these people had his back. I think the more difficult question for you
This is the crazy thing too, is if Trump was to try a military coup, he would probably need some military professionals with him who could actually command a battle. It couldn't just be rank and file Trumpers like rah. If he genuinely wanted to do a military style coup across the whole country, you would need somebody who could manage logistics. You would need somebody who could coordinate such a wild operation. You would need all sorts of stuff. And it's not that I don't doubt that there are people in army somewhere who might agree with it. What I do doubt is that there's high-ranking professional soldiers in the leadership who know what they're doing and are not, knuckle draggers who would sign up to such a mission.
is that if he really didn't think that there was going to be like violence at the Capitol, if he really didn't want any of that to happen, why didn't Donald Trump pick up the phone and call anybody to get the National Guard there to protect the Capitol building? By
the way, our governor, I'm in Maryland. I was in the Capitol the day of. I watched J6 go down. I saw them attack the press and the rest of it. But I mean, the Maryland governor sent over the Larry Hogan offered to send over the National Guard. I remember hearing saying where's Maryland's right there. Where's our National Guard? And it took hours and hours for them to respond and finally get somebody down there in order to get the situation under control. When again, this is like the most basic rules of the presidency and job of the presidency is to protect the United States, protect the seat of power, to protect American democracy. And he couldn't even accomplish that on a basic level because he was having too much fun watching his boys beat up the cops.
And when Ivanka, when Meadows went in over and over again, when other congressmen were calling him, why is it that when the violence was at its peak, why was it just him, Eastman, and Giuliani making phone calls to other congressmen to, surprise, surprise, delay the certification of the vote?
Okay, I promise I'm going to answer that, but I want to go back to the question that I posed.
God, Destiny's on point in this conversation.
To you first, and the answer that you gave to me. Oftentimes, first of all, if it's true,
you got to make him answer it,
that the leaders of the armed forces and the intelligence community and every one of these armed executive agency branches, even including ATM and all the DEA and all these other ones, all were in the posture that they did not regard themselves as duty-bound to follow Donald Trump's orders. If you're somebody, and I don't mean you're saying this had already been the case.
Hold on, I kind of just as a real quick, as you say this, you just as a real quick, you keep saying this, duty bound to follow Trump's orders.
It's not about following his orders. It's about overthrowing the government and putting their lives and careers on the line for a man with not that particular amount of skill in the job, for a man that hasn't particularly respected you all that much, and for a man that constantly showed that he was unable to do the job. And they were going to usurp hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of American democratic tradition in order to do it for that guy, for the guy from The Apprentice. Yeah, no, I don't think they were willing to go back on what they swore to protect when they took the oath. Yeah, I don't think they're going to go back on it for Trump. There's a difference between obeying what is the constitutional orders given by the president as the chief executive and overthrowing the government against the Constitution which Trump called to suspend when he lost. There's a difference there. One is following the law and one is not. One is following the democratic traditions of the United States. The other one is usurping it and trying to crush it.
Orders, the oath that you take is to the Constitution of the United States, not to the President of the United States. Just to be very clear. Go ahead.
You have the right.
Thank you.
The president is the head of the executive branch. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces.
And he is below the Constitution. He is below the Constitution.
If you are in the military, you are duty-bound to obey orders. Now, you can object if you think the order is illegal. You do actually have that right. And as I said...
Yeah, and I think that if Mark Milley was given the order to overthrow the government for Trump, he would have disobeyed the order. And I think Trump knew that, because they didn't like each other. So it wasn't just it was illegal. It was also, why would Mark Milley, of all people, do him that hell of a favor?
My question, I'm sure a lot of them would have done that. But there's no question that there are members of the military and members in these agencies that absolutely were loyal to Trump. And oftentimes what has happened in coups and those sorts of other things is that members of the various military branches or of the armed wings of the government break up into factions and often start fighting one another. That's how you get a civil war. So even if Milley or the leader of the CIA, who at that point was Gina Haspel, who he had actually appointed, would have done what you claim, which is a pretty significant threat to democracy. They regarded themselves as antithetical or adversarial to the president, not subordinate to him. There's definitely a good chance that a lot of those people who have guns and run the power structure of the United States would have answered his call and been on his side. The fact that he didn't even try is so reflective of the fact that this was not an insurrectionary intent.
I love the ideas like Trump didn't call any military guys and tell them to start shooting the Democrats. And since he didn't do that, even though he did call the Secretary of State of Georgia and try to get him to change the election results, even though he did make a fake, false, fraudulent slate of electors to challenge the real slate of electors, so American votes mean nothing after making such a stink about fraudulent votes and such a stink about electoral fraud, in order to make the vote tally shady enough to send it back to the states so he could win. He was willing to do all these things. He was just smart enough not to have, and mafia bosses are smart enough to do this. They're smart enough not to call up someone and say, hey, on the phone, I want you to shoot this guy. He was smart enough to know not only who would do his bidding, like Rudy Giuliani, for example, illegally, or try to go around the law for him, like people like Rudy Giuliani, people who are his fixers, and the people who wouldn't, which are the people who respect the institution more than the man, which, by the way, is supposed to be everyone in the position, choosing the Constitution over the president.
He walked out of the office peacefully on January 20th at noon, the way every other president previous to him had done as part of the peaceful transition of power. There were so many things that he could have done. Now, just remind me what the question is that you asked that I promised you.
Yeah, and before we do this, can I actually take a step back, because I just want to actually take a step back. So Glenn, you said it wasn't an insurrection because on January 6th there was no threat to actually overthrowing democracy or actually doing anything major. Destiny, as far as I understood from your previous response, and I want to get this clear before we move on, you're saying it's not just January 6th, it's also all the events leading up to it.
I think that's a lot of it, but we don't even have to.
Is it worth going into it just so we exactly know why you think it's an insurrection and what specific events led up to it?
We can go into that to assign more culpability to Trump, but we don't need that. Just on the events of J6 itself, it is very plainly and clearly obvious, unless you have heavy political motivations to believe otherwise, that what happened was an insurrection. They're just, every single element is there, and we can try to pivot with this like, well, usually people do this. I agree that usually people do some things, but just because usually people do something doesn't mean that that's always the case, as you've said yourself.
I remember talking to Destiny about whether or not what happened in Bolivia was a coup a while ago, and there was an element of like, well, if the usually there has to be blood and there has to be military, and he has grown so much since that conversation and the amount of knowledge he knows around this topic specifically. It's good to see that he isn't just staying in place. That isn't to say that he's like mastered foreign policy or anything. I would still say on the general, in topics that he talks about, it's probably the area he's still the weakest in, even though he's been making some marked improvements in his general knowledge about it. But since then, it's like a different person.
There are constitutional coups. Some people might consider the Enabling Act that, Hitler did in order to become a dictator in Germany was a kind of constitutional coup. Some people claim that Evo Morales in Bolivia was trying to enact some sort of coup. Some people say that in Ukraine, when Yanukovych left and that parliament decided to elect a new president, some people call that a coup. There are lots of coups that can happen or rebellions, or not rebellions. There are lots of coups that can happen that are for a variety of reasons.
God, you got to ask him if what happened in Ukraine is a coup.
Not involving the military. We can look at the president and say, well, why didn't he try? We can think of a number of reasons why he didn't try.
Well, that one worked, so therefore it is.
because he didn't have the support of the military, because he thought it would be incredibly risky, because he thought it would devolve into chaos. He wouldn't have a clean transition of power. Nobody here is claiming that Trump is brave. Nobody here is claiming that Trump wants to lead an armed insurrection to the White House. His own handlers told him that he wasn't even allowed to go to the White House, even when he begged that he wanted the Secret Service to drive him there. So we can think of a number of reasons why Trump, didn't actually order the military to go and show up and start killing people. What I'm curious, though, is to my question, you asked me what my question was, why did Trump sit and watch the violence carry on at the Capitol building and not try to intervene, despite the fact that he had the authority and many would argue the responsibility to do so? Why would he sit and watch it?
Well, first of all, when Trump, and people may have thought he waited too long, it took him too long to realize the significance of the events, although I don't see the events as nearly as significant as you. We've had tons of protests before at the Capitol. He knew those people were angry and had gone there to...
The difference is we have never had the certification of the vote delayed like that, and the end result of it didn't deal with any of the underlying problems that created January 6th, which was the people being lied to about the results of the election. One of the major parties not accepting the results of a major democratic election. Let me just say, if one party doesn't accept when they lose in a democracy, the democracy can start to break down, because democracy only works if the people involved in it participate. But if you decide to, flip over the chessboard every time you take an L, well, the system can't function. So I do think that there is a significant difference between this and a CVS being burnt down. CVS being burnt down is bad, but it doesn't do the long-term institutional damage to our democracy in the same way that charging on the Capitol and then dealing with none of the underlying problems that created that violence. I'm not dealing with that at all. Yeah, I do think that's significant in a different way.
To protest, but he actually did. First, he went on Twitter and he told everybody there, leave now, don't use violence. Violence is not the kind of thing.
Hold on, just as a quick fact.
Hours after the fact, by the way. I remember watching so much go down before people started reading out that tweet live.
He did not say that in his first. He did not say that on Twitter.
He said that in tweets on January 6th. He absolutely did, repeating the message that he gave to the crowd before they went to the Capitol, which is, I know that you're going to go there and peacefully protest. That was the message that he consistently delivered to them, both before January 6th at the protest and after. Secondly, this was a protest that turned into a riot that was quelled in a matter of hours. It started in the afternoon and it was over in the afternoon. And in order to quell it, they didn't even need to open fire. As we know now, we should have known this 2 years ago, but the January 6th Commission purposely concealed the videos that negated the kind of narrative they wanted to feed. A lot of the people who ended up in the Capitol because the Capitol Police opened the door.
This is just not true. Can we focus on one false fact at a time before we dive into every conspiracy theory that for some, I don't know why people.
It's not a conspiracy theory.
It is a conspiracy theory. We've seen all the videos.
I watched it on video.
Which video? What video did you watch?
The videos that were actually released finally to the public, not handpicked by Adam Schiff and Liz Cheney, once Kevin McCarthy and then Mike Johnson fulfilled their promise to make sure the public could see all of the video, not the video that they handpicked.
You're right. I'm sorry. You're talking about the footage that McCarthy handpicked to give to Tucker Carlson that he made a 30-minute documentary out of?
No, I'm talking about the decision by Mike Johnson, a promise he made as a condition to be the speaker, to make all of the January 6th surveillance footage available to the public, not just the hand-picked parts that Liz Cheney and Adam Schiff decided to show us. It was all an effort from the very beginning to lie in order to exaggerate and make this event seem...
By the way, the reason why it wasn't as bipartisan as originally requested is because when there was an attempt by Nancy Pelosi to create a bipartisan committee, that was shot down, and so then they were like, fine, then I'll just make one where we get to choose who's on it, and we'll put Adam Kissinger and Liz Cheney on it to make sure we have Republicans on it. And they chose the Republicans who were disgusted by what happened on the day. They should have worked with them to create an actual bipartisan committee, but that didn't work.
What's worse than it was, including this insane claim that was an absolute lie that Brian Sicknick was murdered by a savage mob of Trump supporters when he had his skull bashed in with a fire extinguisher until he died.
Okay, hold on. One fake claim at a time. So, firstly, Donald Trump's initial tweets were not to leave. And when you ask, when you claim over and over again that, you know, they managed to calm it down in 3 hours, that was because finally, like 2 or 3 hours after everything, on Trump's, I think it was his third tweet, after being begged over and over again, after
by his children, by the way, his children, there are messages, which are public record now, of his children complaining to each other, like, why isn't he doing anything? He needs to do something. He needs to tell them to leave. And he wouldn't for hours.
Already having the note delivered and sitting on his desk that Ashley Babbitt had been shot and killed, he finally tweeted, okay, you guys can go home. We love you. You're very special. You know, congratulations. The initial two
don't
tweets,
use violence.
The initial 2 tweets that Donald Trump tweeted were not telling.
3 hours, like after people got shot, after 3 hours, we're just sitting there and doing nothing.
People to go home. He already knew there was an ongoing riot, and he tweeted to encourage his supporters to continue protesting. Donald Trump was the president of the United States, who was the highest on the pecking order for delivering the National Guard to protect the Capitol building, and he failed to do that. He failed to do that duty that he had, that was exclusively under the purview of the president, because DC is federal ground, and he didn't do it to stop his protesters that were there to try to delay the certification of the vote of an election that he lost. And during that 3-hour time period, all he was doing was making phone calls or telling Giuliani, his stooge, to make phone calls to other congressmen to delay the certification of the vote, which is exactly what he was trying to do.
Which, by the way, the current House Speaker, Mike Johnson, led the effort to do in the House.
Which is exactly what an insurrection is. It's having a large group of people engaged in violence trying to stop the lawful execution of government action, which is exactly what every historical person has believed.
The fact that you have to resort to this kind of nitpicky behavior, like, oh, he didn't tweet soon enough.
Nitpicky behavior. God, could you imagine, like, firefighters come like 2-3 hours after a fire was reported, and like everybody's burnt to death, it's a disaster, and like, why weren't you here? Like, the fire department's just right there, all you had to do was this, that. You're nitpicking my ability to fight fires? Got a few hours, like, okay. This nitpicking, obviously. Nitpicking. Response time of the president, nitpick. Obviously, the president, you know, maybe the president needed to get a Coke. Maybe the president needed to watch a full Lord of the Rings movie. Maybe the president needed to watch Jackass 1 and 2. You know, he's a busy guy.
3 whole hours to get these people very easily to march peacefully out of the Capitol is more than anything that I could do to show what an absurd farce this entire thing is. Like, you mentioned other historical examples. And by the way, like, please stop using our time to like constantly proclaim like everybody agrees with me. It's so clearly and provably true that what I'm saying is correct. These are not arguments. Let's just like eliminate that fluff and try and focus on like the substance. You can go and do all your post videos, like post debate videos about why you won to your audience. But for now, let's just focus on the facts.
Okay, focus on the facts. Like, how did the first people get into the Capitol building? Were they let in or did they break in?
Let's go back to the tweet. I just want to focus on the tweet because Destiny, you said that you actually posted tweets encouraging them to actually continue. What tweets were those? Because Glenn said, of course, that was he actually told them to stop.
So when the riots were going on at the Capitol, Mark Meadows, because other people went to him, and other people continued to go in. Initially, it was to talk to Trump, and then I think Justin Meadows, because Trump had locked himself in his room, just watching what was going on, begging him to please tweet out something and tell your supporters to go home. And for the first 2 tweets that Trump set out, he refused to tell people to go home because he enjoyed the protest, because he liked the violence, because he thought it would probably increase his chances of furthering, delaying the certification of the vote. But those first 2 tweets that he sent, yes, after 3 hours when he realized that it wasn't going to help, yes. Increase his chances of furthering, delaying the certification of the vote. But those first 2 tweets that he sent, yes, after 3 hours when he realized that it wasn't going to help, yes.
Sorry, I was muted. God, I gotta stop. I just gotta mute on OBS instead of my mic. I don't know if you guys remember the shooting in Texas, the El Paso shooting. It was the one, I believe it was the El Paso shooting. The one where the cops waited like 2 hours in order to go in and actually kill the shooter, who in the meantime was taking his sweet time to kill every single like kindergartner and child he could. And the cops waited for 2 hours. I don't know if you guys remember this. And I watched the footage. I watched the whole footage, or what's publicly available, and it is horrible. It is horrible. When I say it's horrible, I mean it. I mean it's horrible, horrible. It was hard to watch. It was hard for me to finish, and it was baffling for me to think, how could they wait for 2 hours? It was Uvalde. It wasn't El Paso. For 2 hours to do anything. And then you think about what happened on the Capitol. That was 3 hours. 3 hours. And I want Glenn Greenwald, if he really thinks it's nitpicking, to sit down for 3 hours, right? For 3 hours, just sit there and feel how long that is. When you're talking about a crisis where people are getting beaten and our democracy is having a rabid mob attack it. For 3 hours, that type of inaction from the president who throws a hissy fit and locks himself in his room. Imagine if this wasn't about what happened on January 6th and this was instead about a terror attack, or this was instead about something that could genuinely kill people, $5. A lot of people.
Dylan Burns, my favorite streamer. I hear halftime while watching his stream.
Well, I was muted for just a few minutes. I wasn't muted that long. Thank you for the $5. Point is, though, this is not something that's nitpicky any more than like complaining about the cops like waiting too long in Uvalde to respond is nitpicking. I don't think it's nitpicking. I think response time from the president of the United States, who's supposed to be the head of the armed forces, is pretty important. That's why he has such a sprawling intelligence apparatus, so the presidency can respond quickly to the crises. And instead, while he had all the information, he had all the data, he knew what we could do, and he locked the door, threw a hissy fit, and waited 3 hours.
Look at any of the examples, even like you mentioned Bolivia, where the coup was not, according to most observers of Bolivia, that Evo Morales tried to stay in office. Evo Morales was given the go-ahead to run for a term by the electoral court appointed by the Constitution to make those judgments and allowed him.
Appointed by Maduro. Let's be clear. He had a referendum in Bolivia on whether he should run again, and the people said no, that he shouldn't have another term, that he should like hang up the hat. And then he got angry about it, and so then he went through the courts, and the courts, which are appointed by Maduro, then decided yes, he could have another term. And that's the original source of the crisis. That's not to say that the woman who overthrew him, horrible. The killing of protesters, horrible. But there's some information that Glenn is not including here.
Him to run for a fourth term. Evo Morales ran, he won. People in the West claimed, because they didn't want him to win, that, and it's so ironic, the fraud claim ended up being because he was only 8 or 9 points ahead and you have to be 10 points in order to avoid the runoff and win on the first round, that a bunch of Morales votes came in late at night to put him over that 10%. Very similar to Trump's claim about why there was fraud.
It's absolutely not similar. The claim was that those servers that were being ran were completely and totally unmonitored, not part of any election monitoring.
I feel like Glenn just kind of froze a little bit. I think he's a little surprised that Destiny remembers this, but I remember the first conversation I ever had with Destiny was about what happened in Bolivia. And it was me saying to Destiny, like, hey, I do think this is a coup. You can argue that it's a correct coup if you want to, but the people who are taking over are insane. Look at all these protesters getting killed. Like, you need to, like Evo Morales is a brute. He violated the wishes of the people, but by running after having that vote and disregarding the vote. Like, there's other things you can argue here, but he does know this, at least if he can remember.
Procedure, and that nobody could verify any of the votes that were going in and out of that server. I absolutely know what I was talking about. And the fact that you say that Evo Morales was allowed to run for another term, the reason why people accuse it of being a coup is because, or why they thought it was because he was in charge of electing or appointing a lot of the court members that would eventually go on to overturn the part of the Constitution that allowed him to run for a third and fourth term.
After having a referendum asking should he run again, and the people voted no.
The idea that he just the court,
again, the woman that tried to overthrow him is a far-right maniac, and they killed a bunch of people. I have no love for her whatsoever. But don't pretend Evo Morales is like, you know, there's some context here that Glenn didn't include. But I understand he can't run through all the history of the entire crisis. He just cite what's important for the discussion they're having. Center it back on Jan 6.
He had been president, but he had been president. Let me make my point about Bolivia. He was president for 12 years. What happened was, when he was declared the winner, and even think tanks that had suspected fraud ultimately reviewed all of what happened, and the
Did I say Maduro? Oh, sorry. If I said Maduro, I meant my mic is down. Okay, before I was told my mic's too up. Do I have to turn it further up? Like it's not high enough? I'll do my best. I'll just yell louder then, I guess. But no, it's not Maduro. It's Evo Morales.
Reason there were so many pro-Morales votes at the end is because the outer regions with indigenous and rural voters, which had always been his base, are always the votes that come in late, and which is what put him over the top. But not only did I report on this, I was the first journalist to interview Evo Morales in English after that series of events. And in order to interview him, I couldn't go to Bolivia. You know why I couldn't go to Bolivia? Because he had been driven out of Bolivia by the military and the police that threatened to murder him and his whole family if he didn't leave Bolivia. He then had to go to Mexico where he sought asylum, and that's where I interviewed him. And then in that next week, the interim coup government, the leaders of whom are now in prison, ended up murdering all of the, not all, but many of the peaceful protesters who were contesting the fact that the military and the police drove Evo Morales out of the country. That's what happens in a coup. When the people with the guns come and say, we're now taking over, we're going to decide who's in power. We don't care that you were certified the winner of the election. We demand that you either leave Bolivia or we're going to murder you. Every event that is seriously viewed as a coup, whether the coups in South America throughout the Cold War, the coup in Iran that has happened, you go through all over the world and you look at coups, almost always they involve not 100 people or 120 people for 2 hours.
Germany, 27 people.
Protesting and rioting in the capital.
Talking about that far right coup, man. Again, like he's trying to make a definition that is made, by the way, 100 people, 200 people. We're talking about 2,000 people in the Capitol. I thought that was the number we agreed on.
None of whom pulled out a gun and discharged a weapon at any point. It involves real sustained violence by the serious factions in that country that dominate with violence. And nothing like that happened here on January 6th.
The reality was there was violence on J6th. You literally, we've all watched the videos.
Yes. There were a small number of Trump supporters, as I said, 10% of the people
who
were engaged in fighting with the police.
By the way, 10%, again, that it doesn't have to be the whole crowd for it to be an insurrection. It can be a small percentage of the crowd, and that percentage of the crowd was the percentage that engaged in insurrection. You don't need to say the entire crowd engaged in insurrection, just that part of the crowd.
How did they get into the Capitol? Glenn, how did they get into the Capitol?
They used force in order to break in.
Yes.
I'm not saying
they used force to break into the Capitol. Okay. How did they get through the rest when cops were pointing guns at them saying, don't come in here? What were they doing? They were breaking windows. How did Ashley Babbitt get shot? They were trying to go to places where lawmakers were, where they were saying, don't come. And what did they end up doing? They delayed the certification of the vote or the execution of the law of Congress of the Constitution.
By the way, we had a poll on who won this debate. Destiny, or who's winning. It was 94% Destiny, 5% Glenn. I think I might have a little bit of a bias in this poll, but just in case you're interested.
Okay, Glenn,
how many people on January 6th?
Glenn, all of these questions are bullshit. How many people is not a real, that's not a real contention. It doesn't matter.
You can not think much of my questions, but I'd still appreciate if you answered them. How many people on January 6th were killed by these quote-unquote insurrectionists? How many people did they kill on January 6th?
It doesn't matter. How many people died in Fort Sumter? How many people died for the start of the Civil War in the United States? How many people died?
By the way, the coroner said that Brian Sicknick, which people say wasn't killed by January 6th, the coroner still says that the events of the day contributed to his death.
Fort Sumter.
Also, Ashley Babbitt got shot.
Just answer to humor.
Hey, all of the people who were invading Venezuela on Operation Gideon or whatever, the only people that died were the people trying to overthrow the government. Does that mean it wasn't? Okay, I'm sorry. He's working. He's bending himself in pretzels.
How many people were killed by the insurrectionists on January 6th?
I guess it depends on if you count them taking drugs. Is that killing themselves?
Right. The only people who died, right, you can say some of them actually died, and one of them was shot by the Capitol Hill police, but the people who are being called insurrectionists or the attempted coup against the most powerful militarized nation in the world did not kill a single person on January 6th. That was why
that Operation Gideon wasn't an attempt to overthrow Venezuela. Not a single Venezuelan soldier died. How could you say this was really an attempt to do anything when not a single Venezuelan soldier died? Until Venezuelan soldiers die, it's not serious. And we shouldn't really like what we're gonna call it an invasion, we're gonna call it a coup, we're gonna call it an attempted anything. Like nobody died on their side though. So the logic just doesn't make sense to me, man.
Why the anti-Trump media had to invent
That has
a
no
lie
stop with the
that
weird
a Capitol Hill
partisan
police officer.
Oh my God.
It shows what a
it's
joke
such a
this
partisan. You're
entire
such a
riot
partisan
was.
hack. Just engage with the facts. Both of us agree that you don't need people to die for it to be an insurrection, right? So why do you keep bringing that up?
I'm a partisan. You're the one who goes around devoting yourself and urging people to vote for one of the two political parties. I have never done that in my entire life. I've spent the last 4 months attacking one of the core policies of the Republican Party, which is U.S. support for Israel. I don't go around encouraging people to vote for the Republican Party. You're the one who goes around. Your entire community is filled with Democratic Party partisans.
True.
How dare you call anybody else a partisan? That is what you are.
How dare you?
Your core destiny.
Glenn, can I bring it back? Can I bring it back to the debate? So
why did
where's the destiny? Let's just go back to the debate. You said at no point was this an attempted coup at all. So I know it's not exactly on January 6th, but I want to talk something about this. So there was a phone call. Trump made a phone call to a governor. I'm sure you've heard it went really well. Not really well, but went quite big. Of him asking to find 11,000 votes. Would you not call that at all, or doing a coup, or trying to bring votes to win?
No, if you assume that Trump believed that there was serious voter fraud in Georgia, as he did believe and as he was being told by many of his advisors, including lawyers who had been celebrated as some of this country's most prestigious lawyers for years, who were telling him there was ample voter fraud in Georgia, he was trying to say, I don't even need you to prove that every last ballot that was fraudulent be discovered. I just need you to find 11,000. I know the interpretation that people want to give to that. They always want to try and pretend that Trump meant something sinister, like, oh, invent 12,000 cases of voter fraud so that I can win Georgia. That isn't all what the context was. The context was, I believe there was ample fraud in Georgia. People are telling me in an informed way there's ample fraud in Georgia. I personally don't believe that claim, but that was the context of what that call was about. And so, I mean, if that is a coup, you call someone up and you say, I think that, first of all, this is not the first time that people have believed that elections were committed by fraud. In fact,
he's going to bring up
Democrats
Russiagate
believe that the last 3 elections that they lost were illegitimate. In 1960, historians widely believe that that election was stolen by a combination of voter fraud in Chicago that made John Kennedy the winner over Richard Nixon. There was that
every talking point, whatever you can to not engage with the actual
of electors.
Substance of what's going on.
1876, there was huge, pervasive allegations of voter fraud.
I don't see how this conversation moves from here. It really feels like they've reached a, not necessarily like an impasse, like there's a certain ending point. It just feels like anytime they get to an area where Glenn Greenwald gets uncomfortable, like talking about the historical examples, they pivot out and they move on to something else. Or what about this? Or what about that? Like, why the hell were we even talking about okay. I just don't see how this conversation moves anymore. We're going to watch more of it because it is still a big talk, but I think we've seen the end of any constructive dialogue being done.
Sit there and mutter all you want, Destiny. I'm not going to play on your little field. If you don't want to look at history, you don't want to put this in context. The reason is because you have blinders on. You only know the CNN version of the world. You're one of those people who only began paying attention.
Okay, so then let's just be very clear then. Would you say would you say that the Battle of Fort Sumter, would you consider that the Fort Sumter event, would that have been an insurrection to you? Even only one person died?
Without anything else that followed, without the entire
without anything else that followed. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if I would consider that an insurrection or not.
Okay, so for the whiskey insurrection, where no
Fort Sumter is because of the part that it played in the Civil War. It's the Civil War that made that so historic.
Well, that's fine, but again, your analysis there is ahistorical because people considered that others that were giving aid to Confederate states as they succeeded before any actual violence happened were insurrectionists. So if you think that Fort Sumter was not an insurrection if the Civil War followed, that's fine. That's an insane take. Especially given that Lincoln literally invoked the Insurrection Act right after Fort Sumter, but that's fine if you think that wasn't an insurrection. Okay, so for the Whiskey Rebellion, do you think for the Whiskey Insurrection?
The thing, this is where Destiny should be staying. He should be starting in the historical examples, because if you stay in the historical examples, it's just going to show how Glenn's standard could mean that anything is an insurrection to nothing is an insurrection. It's just choosing it willy-nilly. If you cannot consider the Whiskey Rebellion an insurrection, then your definition of insurrection is fundamentally broken, and it is becoming partisan. It is an insurrection is whatever, like, is whenever it gets it's violent in a way that I don't like, or it's when they got guns. Like, it's all these asterisks that don't deserve to be there, and I think it's only there because he doesn't want to call it an insurrection.
That also wasn't an insurrection because people didn't die?
Fort Sumter did not just appear out of nowhere. It was not a spontaneous protest that turned into a riot. It was
so insurrections have to be built up to. And there was nothing that Trump built up to January 6th, like telling all the people to go there, or the Million MAGA March, which I was there as well a few weeks before, and that was violent as hell. People got stabbed, people got maced. I got maced, but got very lucky, not ever got in my eyes. Proud Boys charged us. There was a buildup of violence. There was a notes to local activists. I remember being told by local counter-protesters, like, hey, we're not going to show up at the Capitol. We're not even going to be there. In that Million MAGA March, they were there. We're not going to be there because this one's different. We're told it's going to be really bad. And then there's all the rhetoric Trump had. The election was stolen. The country's dying. And the dictatorship of Joe Biden. Yeah, I do think there was a buildup. That was months and months of buildup to what happened on Jan 6. It was the Stop the Steal event. I mean, so yeah, there was buildup.
What became an obvious attempt on the part of the South.
Even though I don't think that's a necessary component, you can still find that component.
Fort Sumter did not just appear out of nowhere. It was not a spontaneous protest that turned into a riot. It was part of what became an obvious attempt on the part of the South to launch a rebellion against the North and to secede from the Union. Lincoln knew what was going to follow. And I think this is an important point. If what happened after January 6th involved acts of Donald Trump trying to extend what happened on January 6th by repeating violent protest or trying to threaten the stability of the United States government and all.
For those of you asking about the songs in my intro music playlist, they're available on my YouTube channel, my playlist. The one you're asking for, the Ukrainian folk song, it's the last one in my music on my main channel, DylanBurnsTV.
All the different ways that he could have done but chose not to, had he not walked out peacefully of the White House on January 20th, we would be looking at all of these sets of events differently. That's an imaginary history that would make it more like the Civil War. None of that happened, however.
Fort Sumter, if the Civil War
riot and Donald Trump walking out of the White House peacefully.
So the Civil War, or for Fort Sumter, for the Civil War that followed, if that hadn't had followed, even though Lincoln invoked the Insurrection Act to deal with Fort Sumter, you would say that that wasn't an attempted insurrection. That wasn't an insurrection.
I mean, it's such a counterfactual and such a hypothetical that it's impossible.
What do you mean a hypothetical? That's basic American history. Okay, is Glenn Greenwald American? I know he lives in Brazil. Is he a Brazilian American? He has to be. He has to be American, right? He talks about American politics, goes goddamn much. He is American, right? He should know, like, basic American history.
Imagine taking Fort Sumter, tearing it out of its context of a nation that had been heading for civil war for a long time, where they were doing everything.
Yeah, but that's only noticeable after the fact that they were headed towards civil war for a long time. And guess what? If we had a civil war tomorrow, I bet there would be a bunch of people who would say, well, there was this trade and there was this instability and there was these things that were heading them in that direction.
Possible to avert it. Lincoln understood that Fort Sumter was not some isolated event of a 2-hour riot that was easily subdued, but knew that the entire South was armed to fight against the North. Take Fort Sumter and completely change every single fact and tear it out of its historical context, and then trying to debate whether or not it's insurrection is a child's game.
Let's say that after Fort Sumter, let's say they were crushed so hard and so fast that there was a sweeping change of mind among the states, and they were like, you know what? Oof, this Lincoln guy seems serious. Let's not go to war and have hundreds of thousands of us die. And they decide to not do that instead. In your eyes, Fort Sumter would have then not been an insurrection.
Yeah, I think there's a good analogy to that, which is the one I mentioned earlier.
No, it would have still been an insurrection. It just would have been a failed insurrection. It still would have been an insurrection against government authority at Fort Sumter and an attack on the bill. It would still be an insurrection.
Which is what happened in Russia, where Prigozhin...
No, let's just talk about the United States.
No.
Are we saying that Prigozhin's thing isn't an insurrection? That's an insurrection too.
No, you want it? We're going to pivot to to Russia, a totally different system with a totally different set of laws, with a totally different.
You're saying no, stick to this.
This is such an easy yes. It was obviously an
the Prigozhin thing was an insurrection, by the way. It obviously was an insurrection.
Insurrection. It was so obviously an insurrection. The idea that you're trying to argue that Fort Sumter was only an insurrection because of acts that
you can't argue that it wasn't a coup, because there's a question about whether Prigozhin was challenging Putin or whether he was challenging the military establishment. I tend to believe that he was challenging Shoigu and Gerasimov, and that he was trying to kidnap them. That's what the reports I read seemed to lead me to believe. So I believe it was an insurrection, usurpation of the government's authority around here, and trying to usurp the military establishment while not trying to overthrow Putin's government. That's why I think it's an insurrection, but not necessarily a coup. But people call it a coup, but it could have been. We really don't know because we're not in Prigozhin's head.
No, stick to this.
This is such an easy yes. It was obviously an insurrection. It was so obviously an insurrection. The idea that you're trying to argue that Fort Sumter was only an insurrection.
It was a mutiny. No matter what, it was a mutiny. But it was also an insurrection.
An insurrection. It was so obviously an insurrection. The idea that you're trying to argue that Fort Sumter was only an insurrection because of acts that came after is unbelievable to me. What came after was a rebellion.
And the acts that came before. The idea that Fort Sumter was analogous in any way to January 6th, even taking Fort Sumter and imagining that nothing else happened after, that is what is ahistorical. If you're, what a real coup looks like is what Prigozhin tried to do in Russia. But in the context of...
Again, we legitimately don't even know if that was a coup. God, even the things that he do name as a coup, I disagree with Glenn. That was an instance where I don't know if it was a coup, because we don't know if Prigozhin's intention was to overthrow the government, or what I think, challenge the military establishment, because Wagner Group was getting boxed out by the military establishment, being strangled from new prisoner recruits, and more supplies were going elsewhere, and they were constantly complaining of ammo shortage. This was after the Battle of Bakhmut, after a very vicious battle where many of his soldiers died, and months and months and months of buildup of his rhetoric online. But it was still, we still don't have any evidence that he was specifically trying to overthrow Putin's government.
Of Russian history, even in a few years now, that will be a tiny little footnote, because it never posed a serious or meaningful threat to the system of power that governs Russia. It was crushed in 12 hours, and now Prigozhin is dead. So if you have the magnitude of these events is what matters so much. Like, when the very first thing you said in that first debate was you tried to create this dichotomous framework, this very reductive binary framework that either you believe, and this is almost quoting you verbatim, you said, either you believe that the insurrection was justified and that nothing wrong happened on January 6th, or you have to admit that there was a coup. And the very first thing I did when I spoke was linked onto that and said, that is an absurd framework. Of course, there's a gigantic difference between acknowledging that people behaved poorly on January 6th, behaved in ways we wish would not happen, seeing citizens be shot despite being unarmed.
How many people died for the Prigozhin stuff? How many people died when he did his attempted coup? What, they shot down a few helicopters? Was it like 5 or 10 people that died? How many people even died for that?
Around, I think it was like 10 to 25, I think.
There were more than 24 Russian troops that were killed. Imagine if the group of people at the Capitol had shot down actual U.S. military planes and military.
So then would it have been an insurrection? How many planes do they have to shoot down? 1 plane or 2 planes? How many planes do they have to shoot down? So they have to have guns and they have to shoot down planes. I'm sorry. God, he's working so hard just not to use. Why not just bite the bullet, but then say it wasn't a serious insurrection? That'd be so much easier. It'd be, I mean, from his perspective.
Military jets and murdered American soldiers.
So for one person, so how many people needed to die then on J6 for you to think that that was a coup insurrection? What is the number then there?
The criterion for me is not how many people died. The criterion for me is how serious of a threat did it pose, or does it pose, to the actual system of power.
Why does that have to be important? Why does that have to be important? It could be a shit threat to the system and still be a threat to the system. You just call it like it was a piss poor coup. Why does it have to be a coup that has a chance of success for it to be a coup, or for it to be an insurrection, it has to have a chance of success? This makes, then that would mean the vast majority of historical examples that are called insurrections wouldn't be insurrections. I mean, there's so many that like historians after the fact would be like, well, all these factors were counting against them, or resource management, lack of training, and all these things meant that there was not really much of a chance of them succeeding. Most revolutions fail So all of the ones that were thwarted and then historians after the fact are like, that didn't have much of a chance of success. It doesn't count. I mean, then how would the South count? There's historians who look at demographics, industrial capacity, strategy, and to determine or to try to assert that it was very difficult to nigh impossible for the South to win the Civil War. Not everybody believes it, but some do. And if you were able to make that argument, would you then say it wasn't an insurrection? It just seems like such an arbitrary standard.
In the United States, and the fact that this 2-hour, 3-hour riot filled with people who were too obese to get off the couch without dropping dead of heart attacks, and maybe had a couple of dozen or a few dozen well-armed and well-trained people there, that it ever posed a meaningful threat to the system of power.
So got it. When they're fat, it also doesn't count.
United States is a complete and utter joke. It reminds me so much.
So they have to have guns, shoot down planes, and be skinny.
Of the people who tried to say that Russia buying a few Facebook ads or a few Twitter bots was the kind of interference
That's
in the
fine.
democracy.
I don't know why
that
you're
was
pivoting
so
to no one is talking.
That's the thing, though. That is election interference. You're trying to interfere in the American election. That is the intent of it. You could just say that it wasn't that particularly effective at interfering in the American election.
About Hillary or the...
You could even make the argument that even if it is like public diplomacy in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It's the spreading of misinformation that's a bad thing.
Laptops.
Do you know what an analogy is? An analogy is when
it's
you
not an
say that
analogy.
one
It's a
thing is something
whataboutism and a
compare
pivot
it
because you don't want to
another.
actually argue the facts of this. That's what it is. They're not analogies. They're not used to strengthen their argument. They're used to obfuscate.
Let's go back to January 6th. So Glenn said that not on January 6th there was no actual, at no point in time was an actual threat to the democracy. Destiny, is that what specific point would you say, or specific example could you say, no, this was a threat?
It's a fantastic delusion. If you were to take Glenn or anybody else that has their whatever their partisan takes on this, if you were to take them, put them in a room with artists and animators, and then have them describe what J6 was, then the animators would draw, I don't know, I guess like 500 Greenpeace activists picketing outside the Capitol building with signs saying, we don't like that you guys are trying to steal the election. That's what it sounds like. And then maybe a few of them got let in by the Capitol Police to walk around. Thankfully, however, thank God, we're in an era where we all have videos, we all have the internet, we can see the tens of thousands of people outside screaming, we can watch the brawling with the Metropolitan Police. That's not all they did, Glenn. We can watch them brawling with the Metropolitan Police. We can watch them breaking into the Capitol from like 500 different...
I wonder if Glenn Greenwald went to his house and like there was 2,000 people outside it and they were just banging on the walls like, don't do it, hang Glenn Greenwald, hang Glenn Greenwald. He would look outside and be like, oh, wow, 3 hours? That's not serious. I'm going back to sleep.
Angles. We can watch Ashley Babbitt getting shot as she's trying to crawl through a window where lawmakers are in direct opposition to federal police shooting her. We can watch every single one of these events unfold in real time, and it doesn't look like anything that's being described by Glenn. Instead, the only response is Glenn says we saw the real videos because Tucker Carlson published 0.3% of the footage that McCarthy granted him that doesn't change any of the underlying facts of what we've seen. Yeah, were there some people that were walking through the Capitol building because the police were trying to guide them to another area where they could more easily secure it? Yeah, of course. Were some people guided through and then led into a chamber because police had an easier control of that area than something else? Yeah, sure. But again, we've all seen the videos. You admitted yourself that the first entrance into the Capitol broke in. The first people to breach the barricades broke them down. Nobody was let into a new initial area because the Capitol Police...
That's the thing that gets me about people who talk about like, oh, well, they just kind of wandered in. Multiple police signs were broken through. Windows had to be smashed. It wasn't like people at the Capitol that day were unaware of the violence that had occurred. You could see it. You could hear it as the information traveled throughout the crowd, which isn't talked about enough in reports of how I wasn't at the Capitol and I was told as I was walking in the general direction of the Capitol that they were storming it, which then caused other people to go like, oh, they're storming the Capitol. And then they all ran towards the Capitol because they're like, oh my God, history. Yeah, we're going to show them, because they were riled up after Trump's speech.
Let them in. They were only sometimes ushered through the building because there were more defensible positions, which is obvious.
That's the thing I don't get. Like, you could say that they peacefully walked around while in the Capitol. They still weren't supposed to be there. And it's not like they were all just completely ignorant of the day's events.
watched any of the video footage available of that day besides the selected clips that people like Tucker Carlson or Glenn Greenwald want you to watch on Twitter. Again, if this was so easy and so simple and there was nobody there but a bunch of fat people, how did the certification of our vote get delayed by 3 hours? And why were we waiting for the national for the first time in all of history?
3 hours.
I think this is the 7th time Glenn Greenwald has made this joke. Maybe one more time, and I think it'll land.
Oh, as opposed to what, Glenn?
I mean, how did the Republic survive? First of all, let me just.
Glenn, how long was the story about Hunter's laptop delayed? How long? How many days was that delayed? 1 day, and you guys say that was a more serious thing, right? Because the story was delayed by 1 day. Come on.
Facebook suppressed that story all the way up until the time of the election algorithmically. But let me just. I want to go back to the history of what we saw with the videos, because you obviously are not familiar with this history. At the beginning, for 2 years, all of the information that
I wonder if cop was like, I'm sorry, I'm just imagining this 3 hours in other context. Glenn Greenwald calls the cops, there's burglars, they're breaking into my home. Okay, we'll get there in about 3 hours. Oh, thank you, that's a reasonable time. Click. Yeah, that's reasonable. That's reasonable response time, especially since the cops know what's going on. They're gonna wait 3 hours. No other context would this work. I'm sorry, it's hard to accept the fact that Trump didn't want to do anything. So instead of just acknowledging and be like, yeah, that's bad, he should have done something sooner, and that does at least show that he didn't care all that much. Instead, you have to mock it. You have to mock it.
We got about January 6th was controlled by a partisan commission filled with effectively Democrats, the people.
By the way, and we know that if Glenn Greenwald was at some protest and someone threw a milkshake at him and dinged him in the side of the head, within a few months, the Daily Wire would be recording a documentary about it, and they'd have him dress up like JFK in Texas.
Pelosi let onto the commission. Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger hated Trump almost more than any Democrat.
If the tables were turned and it was his interest group that was at the other end of this, and it wasn't just the bureaucrats and the politicians and the institution, which I do think is important, then the outrage and the reaction to it would be very different.
Those were the two Republicans.
Just as a quick thing, you can't lie. That's not true. Pelosi would have allowed others. Pelosi was going to allow people on there, but unfortunately McCarthy, when he nominated two of those people, Jim Jordan and something Johnson, I think maybe.
Can I just finish?
Well, you're just lying though. You can't lie. You can't just say that things that are lies.
No.
Pelosi accepted people from McCarthy. McCarthy didn't want to nominate more people. That's his fault. Sorry, go ahead.
Nancy Pelosi was the first ever Speaker of the House in 225 years to reject the nominees by the opposing party to serve on an investigative commission. It had never happened in the history of the United States. She was the first one to do it. And so when Nancy Pelosi said...
Let's directly ask Destiny that question. Why did Nancy Pelosi reject those two Republican... Why did she reject them?
So when Nancy Pelosi was forming this committee, she said that McCarthy could nominate 5 people. Of those 5 people, I think it was Jim Jordan and somebody Banks. 2 of these people, a lot of the J6 investigations were probably going to be analyzing their behavior specifically, and Pelosi felt like the presence of those 2 people on the committee would have poisoned the committee. So because
a lot of these people were working with Trump in order to try to overturn the results of the election. So therefore, having people on the committee that are also being investigated, the conflict of interest.
Told McCarthy, I accept your other 3 nominees, just give me 2 others and they can be part of the committee as well. But McCarthy, because he knew January 6th was an insurrection and because he knew that the behavior that day was indefensible, decided to pull all the Republican nominees and say, you know what, screw you, I'm not going to give you anybody. You can just have Kissinger and Cheney or whatever, the 2 people that I know hate Trump, so that afterwards, conveniently, people like Glenn can make this same bullshit argument where they say, oh, well, actually, it was a completely partisan committee, so I'm going to ignore the fact that 95% of the people that were actually testifying were Republicans, and ignore the fact that all of it is under oath, and ignore the fact that all the evidence is easily available, and I'm just going to hand wave all of it by calling it partisan. Meanwhile, I'm going to believe everything that I guess Russia Today tweets about it, or everything that Tucker Carlson puts on his show about it, or everything that McCarthy himself says about it. That was the thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Eli, I just want to go back to the history of the... Sure. First of all, I'll say one more time.
Of the videos.
Never before in the history of the Republic did Nancy Pelosi, did any Speaker of the House or Majority Leader do what Nancy Pelosi did. The prerogative of the minority party to pick their own members to serve on that commission was never subject to the approval of the opposing party until Nancy Pelosi while the Democratic Party always claims it's upholding norms and tradition, decided to block the choices. And so it's true, the Republicans decided we're not going to participate in a farce where for the first time in 225...
You know what's wild here? I think a lot of people, when they're discussing topics, they get very comfortable and kind of slide into their dialogue trees. You know, it's very easy because when you'll kind of see it in someone's eyes, they start to gloss over, and it's more like repeating kind of like ritualistic or religious hymns than it is thinking about the words you're speaking or reacting to something. See, Destiny's point wasn't just an acknowledgement that, yeah, Nancy Pelosi rejected 2 of the people on the committee. His point was the reason why was because they were going to be investigated, and having someone on the committee investigating themselves probably is a conflict of interest. But Greenwald is comfortable and he's had this dialogue tree before. Instead of particularly responding to that, you just go amongst the most walked path, the thing you've said 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times before, and you know that you can say again, and it's worked for you before, so maybe it'll work here. Your ritualistic hymn. And so he just doesn't respond to the question. He pivots around it and answers and says something, gives an answer to a question that wasn't asked.
5 years of our history, Nancy Pelosi...
It's not hard to sit down and think about the discussion you're having. And I'm not saying Glenn Greenwald isn't doing that, but when you give answers like that, it's either you're purposely pivoting or you're just doing basically a ritualistic hymn.
He gets to choose who cannot be on the panel, even though that's who we want and think will be most effective on there. And as a result, Nancy Pelosi ended up choosing those 2 Republicans. They were the ones willing to serve when the rest of the Republicans weren't, and it became a partisan farce.
Again, didn't respond at all to Destiny or Nancy's, I think, legitimate concerns about having someone on a committee investigating people on the committee.
She allowed Kevin McCarthy's members, the way every other speaker for 225 years had done, you would have had an actual bipartisan commission. As a result, the only videos that we saw were videos that were handpicked by these very partisan anti-Trump members who then were allowed to create a narrative filled with lies, beginning with Brian Sicknick getting his head bashed in, and then hiding the videos that undermined their narrative and only allowing us to see the videos that made it look as violent as possible. Then Kevin McCarthy gave the rest of the video to Tucker Carlson so that he could report on them, but that's not even what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that it was Mike Johnson, the newly elected speaker, who released all of the video, and only then did we see the video for the very first time after 2.5 years of these people who were walking into the Capitol being led in by the Capitol Police after they opened the doors and led them in peacefully. So by
the way, people complain about this, like, oh, this is partisan. Why didn't the January 6th committee release that video? To be clear, if you read the January 6th report, I don't know if Glenn Greenwald has, it openly states that that's what happened in the report. So if it was an attempt to cover up that information, why is it in the fucking report? I'm sorry, man. It's just so low effort.
You can say all of these things about January 6th. I said from the very beginning that your tactic is to create this binary where either someone has to
if you want to do facts, that's fine, but I don't need to announce my tactic.
I said from the beginning that it was a riot. There were people who were there on behalf of Donald Trump who used violence. There were police officers who ended up injured as a result, just like happened in the Black Lives Matter protest, although actually police officers, at least one of them for sure, and probably a few others, were killed, and the amount of injuries were far greater. I also don't consider the Black Lives Matter movement, even though it was a lot of people there had insurrectionary intent, anarchist groups and Antifa and others. I don't consider that an insurrection either, though I think you can make a much stronger case that the damage and violence that it posed to our prevailing law and order system was far greater than what happened on January 6th. So yes, you are right that some people used violence to get into the Capitol. Some people broke windows. They were screaming. They were protesting. Things that have all happened before. I don't say that everybody on January 6th behaved properly. I think a lot of them ended up properly being in prison. There were some who used violence. That's because it was a riot and not any real threat to the stability of the United States. It's something that's being exaggerated because the thing that Democrats want to do more than anything is to say that Donald Trump is not just somebody with bad policy or bad ideology. He's an unprecedented threat to American democracy, and his movement ought to be criminalized. And
what were they there to protest? What were they there to protest? What were they there to protest?
Can you specifically respond to the point that Glenn made about the videos?
It's just bullshit. It's literally I don't know. That's like a guy telling you that, you know, yesterday I saw UFOs making crop circles. You know,
you're an
like
absolute liar, Destiny, or you have no idea what you're talking about. Mike Johnson is the one who released all the videos. How do you not know that?
We can walk through this. We can walk through this. We can walk through this very simply. We can walk through this so simply. It's such
Wait, was I muted during that thing I just said? How was I muted? I didn't even have a mute button on. What did I say? What? I don't even remember what I said. I was muted? I'm so confused. I didn't hit any mute button either. How did I get muted? Something's up with this mic, actually.
Easy and simple thing, okay? So why do we bring up that some police officers let people into the building? There is only one of two possible reasons we bring this up. One is to say that, well, the protesters weren't actually violent because...
Okay, so I guess I'll just go back and start saying things that I hope I didn't miss. So the first thing is that the January 6th report included information about the cops leading people around to areas that would be easier to control them after the protesters had already broken through the windows in multiple police lines, and there was no chance of holding them outside of the building. That is true that did happen, and that footage was released. Selective footage was by Tucker afterwards, but that was included in the report. So if the plan was to cover that up, why did they include that in the report? Why would that be included in the report if it was like the secret information that we just got? I don't know if Glenn has read the report or not. I don't know if he, you know, read the full thing, but it is included in there. And it was available once it was released, like at the end of what, 2021?
They were let in, but we know that's false because we got video evidence proving otherwise. And the second is if you want to allege a much larger conspiracy that the police were actually working to allow protesters or rioters into the building, of which there's absolutely no evidence for. Other than that, the only reason, let me respond, let me explain the video. I'm trying to explain it. Other than those two reasons, there is absolutely no reason to reference this video footage. Everybody knows that there were times, even before Mike Johnson and even before Tucker Carlson, we all knew that there was footage of cops leading people in some places around the inside of the Capitol building. People do this with riots all the time. We know that they were understaffed. We know they didn't have enough people to deal with all of the protesters or rioters that were in the building. And we know that lawmakers were being shuffled through the back, trying to make sure that they were in secured areas that protesters weren't. So the idea that it's somehow strange or inconceivable that police officers were leading people into more defensible areas of the building just doesn't make any sense. Like, I could ask very simply, what is the point of saying that there are videos of police officers ushering people or shepherding people into different areas? What's the point of bringing that up? What are you contesting there?
I'll explain it. And this is like, you are the most binary thing I've ever heard. You begin every sentence by proclaiming it is either one or two, and there's no third or fourth or fifth.
Sure, what's 3, 4, 5?
Neither of those two choices is my argument. The reason why it matters is twofold. Number one is it demonstrates that from the start of all of this, the media and Democrats knew that what had happened was nowhere near sufficiently serious in order to present it as some sort of an insurrectionary threat to the United States. That was why the Brian Sicknick lie was important. That was why it was so important to conceal these videos. That's why it took Mike Johnson, the Republicans, taking over the House and being willing to release all the videos, not just the part that was handpicked for us by Adam Schiff and Liz Cheney, to get the real story. The second part is that the reason it's relevant is not because it proves that none of the protesters used violence. I will say, probably for the 8th time, that there were a small number, a minority of people who were at the Capitol and who entered the Capitol who used violence. They used violence against police officers. They attacked police officers with physical force. Some police officers were injured, pretty much like happens in every protest that is turned into a riot. But what it demonstrates is that even though you have to try and reach for this maximum number, 2,000 people who entered the Capitol, the vast majority of them were not part of any premeditated plan to overthrow the U.S. government, as even the FBI's own informants acknowledged to them on that day. And I can read you the New York Times article about that that makes very clear that the FBI's informants on the ground were telling them none of this was planned, this all happened spontaneously, and that even though it is true that a small number of people who were present ended up using violence and fighting with police officers or by engaging in property damage to enter the building, the vast majority of them them were nonviolent. And that is the reason why only a small percentage of them have been accused of violence. And the reason that matters is it goes to the question of the magnitude or the extent of the actual threat that January 6th posed to the American Republic and to our system of government, which was extremely trivial and minor, both in the context of our own history and how other coups happen in other countries as well.
Okay, so none of this was a response to anything. So, and none of these points even make sense. So the first thing you say is it demonstrates from the start that the media and Democrats knew what happened.
You're the winner.
Hold
Just
on.
get to the point.
You said
Stop
in the
saying
beginning.
that you're the winner every minute.
I know that you're scared. I know you're scared of talking about the facts.
Empty.
Glenn, I know you're scared of the facts, but that's okay. Let's follow them. Let's be brave. Let's be brave,
Not
okay?
the part where you call yourself the winner every 5 seconds.
Let's be brave, okay? So you said that it demonstrates that the media and the
Dude, what is he even fucking talking about? I don't know what Glenn is talking. Stop calling yourself the winner. Did I miss something? Am I watching a different conversation than Glenn?
Democrats knew what happened wasn't sufficiently serious. That was the first one you brought up. How does the release of the videos make the event less serious? Was there not a delaying of the certification of the vote? Were there not thousands of people inside the Capitol? Did they not break in to get there?
There weren't thousands of people inside the Capitol. You yourself put the maximum number at 2,000.
What does 1,000 mean, Glenn? Hold on. Maybe English might be your second language. I'm trying to figure out. What does 1,000 mean? Thousands. 2,000 is thousands. There were I'll say 2,000 makes me better. So we know that there were.
That's the maximum number. What the videos show is that at least a significant number of those people did not use violence in order to enter the Capitol. They walked in peacefully and were led
if somebody
in by Capitol
breaks
police officers.
into the building, the
goes
people
to
that
their
come in
intent.
afterwards, of course, are coming in peacefully. In any riot situation like that,
Led in by the police. Led in by the police.
the police are not. But the initial entry into the Capitol was a break-in.
Yes, a small percentage of the people on January 6th had violent intentions.
Glenn, what Destiny is trying to say is that the first people who will come in will do the violence, and the rest of the people will just follow them in and won't do all the violence. So the first person.
It's like saying 1,000 people go in through a broken door and saying, well, only one guy broke down the door. 1,000 people were trespassing through a broken door. Like, do you think the cops, for the cops that were leading them around the Capitol building?
Do you know how many political protests have involved?
Oh my God, the
trespassing
pivot, the
on government property, including the
whataboutism.
Capitol?
None of them try to prevent the execution of the election. That's why this is a historic event. You admitted as much. Nobody's delayed the certification of a vote like this before, and nobody.
It was delayed by 3 hours. It happened on the same day as it was scheduled to happen.
Wait, so Glenn, can you go back to the original point which Destiny made, which is that if you've got those 2,000 people in the Capitol, and you said only a couple of hundred people, or maybe only 100 people will actually be violent. Destiny said it's only the first 100 people that will go through, they will do the violence, and everyone else will be trespassing. Does that make sense, or what's your thoughts on that?
No, because if that crowd were actually there to overthrow the government of the United States or to prevent a peaceful transition of power, they would not have marched in peacefully to the White House when the police let them in and then marched peacefully out of the Capitol when it was time for them to go, which is exactly what happened. There was no violence even needed to subdue this riot or to put an end to it. What it shows is that the vast majority of people there were peaceful protesters. They were absolutely people who believed that the election was the byproduct of fraud. They wanted their voices to be heard in Congress. They wanted the Congress to exercise what their constitutional right was in the view of many people, which was to hear claims of fraud, which is what happened in 2016 and in 2004 and in 2000. The Congress, including members of Congress, objected to the certification of votes. They most definitely were exercising their constitutional rights to protest the 2020 election based on the view that it was stolen.
They're exercising their constitutional rights.
Yes. Oh, no, I agree with everything he just
Exactly.
said. They thought the election was fraud, and so they showed up to try to protest the results of the election. And they did it with violence.
Correct.
Yes, that's called an insurrection.
No,
when you
that-
don't like how an
a
election
percentage
goes,
did it with
and
violence.
you show up to have a riot to try to make it so it doesn't happen, that's an insurrection.
Again, like all this is the thing where I think somebody could splice the difference here, and this is where I would hope Eli would ask: could it be that 90% of the crowd wasn't engaged in an insurrection and 10% of the crowd is? Because if Glenn Greenwald is scared, if this is his reasoning, I'm trying to figure out his reasoning, and I think he's scared of if this term is used for the entirety of the crowd, then could the protesting of election results ever and always be called an insurrection? If only a small percentage of them gets violent, then they crack down on everybody. Then split the difference and say, is the people who went out there, are the people who went out there and stormed the Capitol and were given like over a decade on sedition charges, were they engaged in insurrection? What do you think they were engaged in? If they weren't engaged in constitutionally protected speech, what were they engaging in?
Insurrection, yes.
There were a tiny number of people.
It doesn't matter the number. When you pivot to irrelevant facts like this, there were a tiny number of people. That doesn't matter. It might have been 100. It might have been 2,000. It doesn't matter what the tiny number means.
It does matter. It does matter in terms of the gravity of this threat. And we began the discussion by your conceding that if it were a tiny number of people, like two or three, it would be very difficult to call it an insurrection. So for me,
and yet 500 people was enough to call it the Whiskey Rebellion, even though those 500 men had no chance of taking over the federal government. That was called a whole rebellion, which is more serious than an insurrection. History, legal experts, and the Constitution does not agree with you, Glenn. You are on an island.
This idea that you constantly proclaim that everybody agrees with you and nobody agrees with me, in what fucking world are you living in? You're so
I'm sorry, but the historians don't agree with his classification of the Whiskey Rebellion or his classification of insurrection. Historians don't. Like, there can be traits that coups and insurrections typically have. There's no historian that's going to say, unless these many people at the protest, it isn't an insurrection, or unless they have guns, or unless they shoot down planes, or unless it's serious, as in it has a chance of success. I don't know of any historian that was like, well, if you look at this rebellion, it didn't really have a chance of success, so we're not going to call it an insurrection. Only one. No, I don't know of any historian that classifies it that way. Certainly not how we talked about insurrections in the past. So, yeah, at least when it comes to that angle, you know what? I don't think anybody agrees.
Even in the U.S. Congress, the majority of people in the Senate voted that it was an insurrection. The majority of them, not a supermajority. So even in the Congress, they agreed with me. Yes.
I don't know if you're aware of this, but the person that you claim led this insurrection and that everybody agrees was an insurrection is currently leading in all presidential polls to be the next president, because Americans actually don't see it the way you see it. Another person who doesn't see it the way you see it.
Actually, by the way, that's fucked. 53% of Americans said they're not likely to vote for Trump, and 63% of Americans, if you include the likely not to vote for Trump, and the majority of them don't even want him to run. So somebody could not like Biden and not like Trump somebody could not like Trump for his anti-democratic principles. Somebody could not like Biden because, oh, you think he's too old, or some other reason. Just because, you know, he in some polls is like 2 points ahead does not mean that the American public does not think that he didn't attack democracy in any day. If you poll the American public on January 6th, or how he handled it, if you look at his approval rating post January 6th, it took a massive nosedive in the last few days of administration.
Is Jack Smith, who had the opportunity to charge Donald Trump with insurrection and chose not to.
That's a good argument. If he's really popular, it can't be an insurrection,
you're going to use to put at the beginning of your YouTube video, where you're going to be like, everybody agrees with me, you're on an island. As though I'm the only one who makes these arguments. There are millions of people who think what you're saying is bullshit, Destiny. And the fact that you don't know that shows how insulated you are.
Just because there are people who agree with Glenn does not mean that when it comes to respected voices in the field, that he isn't on an island. For example, John Mearsheimer says a lot of things that he's on an island on. If I was to say, well, nobody else agrees with him, you'd be like, well, look at all of his viewers and his stuff people on YouTube. It's like, yeah, they agree with him. His fans agree with him. Trump's fans agree that Trump is always right. That is true. Trump's fans will say whatever Trump wants them to. A lot of them will. Does that mean that if there's a significant amount of fans that will always say it wasn't an insurrection? If there are people who say that, millions of people who say that the South, seceding wasn't betrayal or treason or wasn't illegal, just because a lot of people believe it doesn't make it true. It doesn't make the argument legitimate either.
Can we go back straight to without the insults, but can we go straight back to the beginning of the debate, which is we started off with trying to define what insurrection meant. I think we lost that way. So, Glenn, you described insurrection as something that has a potential to overthrow
a serious threat to the system of law and order and to the stability of power in that country. That's what I think an insurrection or a coup is.
Destiny, would you agree with that?
Basically, yeah. Public use of force by a group of people in order to hinder or prevent the execution of the Constitution of the United States. Absolutely, yeah.
Yes. Okay, so we keep going back to this, but what happened on January 6th? It delayed it for a couple of hours. Was that trying to overthrow democracy? Was that how does that qualify to be an insurrection?
The reason why it qualifies is because, as Glenn accurately pointed out, the reason why the people were there was because they thought the election had been stolen from them. When they were marching down, they were chanting 1776, and they were going down with the idea that Vice President Pence would unilaterally overturn the election that they thought was done fraudulently in order to soft coup Donald Trump back into power as the rightful leader in contravention of what the Congress was supposed to do, which was the certification of the electoral votes. That was Congress's job. They were there on January 6th, specifically that day, because Donald Trump asked them to be there. They went to the Capitol grounds immediately after his speech because Donald Trump told them to go there. They broke into the Capitol building because they thought that they could delay the certification of the vote. And then when they were there, they only left when Donald Trump told them to. And a lot of them had said in much in all of their convictions that they were waiting for his orders to go home, of which his first two tweets weren't. They were encouraged.
Hey, for those trying to donate right now on my website, because we've been streaming for 3 hours at DylanBurns.TV, stand back and stand by. Appreciate any donations to support the channel.
Encouragement to continue rioting, and they continue to do so even an hour after Donald Trump, the one who's authorized to deploy the National Guard to the Capitol grounds, sat and watched them do it even an hour after finding out that Ashley Babbitt had died. Again, if you want to say that 2 people is an insurrection, not sure, that's fine, but 2,000 is way over wherever either of us would reasonably draw the line.
I think we've gone over sufficiently the amount of people who were actually there engaging in violence of any kind with any kind of an insurrectionary intent, which is the, I'll be generous and say that 100 or 120 of them were being. But can I just establish a point of agreement, because I've never heard you actually acknowledge that this was true, that in this speech you're trying to depict these people as kind of like mindless zombies who just follow the orders of Donald Trump and do whatever he instructs them to do. Do you agree that, and can you acknowledge that in his speech there was one time and one time only where he addressed the question of whether or not violence should be used at that protest they were going to at the Capitol, and when addressing that on one occasion, he told them to go there and protest peacefully? Is that something you acknowledge is what he told them?
So I would acknowledge that. However, on my YouTube channel, we try to engage in serious political analysis. So when I'm engaging in serious political,
you're well known for that.
I know, yeah, as are you, I guess. While we're engaged in serious political analysis, when we're looking at what is actually going on or what's in the minds of people, I would never in my entire life imagine cutting one sentence out of an hour-long speech to try to determine what the actual motivation of that speech was. What I would do is I would look at the totality of the speech. It's possible you've never watched it before because you only read Twitter headlines. Maybe. And I would also.
Okay, there. How long did this last before it got dirty? How long did this last before it got dirty? I would say it got dirty like 20 minutes ago. But now they've fallen into the mud. They're in the mud now. Now it's just a question of how much mud they will cover themselves in.
I would also look at the actions that happened after of both the protesters and the guy who incited the speech to see, what were the actual intentions of what was going on. In that speech, Donald Trump multiple times made allusions to the fact that our democracy was under threat, that our election had been stolen, that Congress was failing the people to act in how they should, and that Vice President Pence was the last hope of saving our republic, and that if you don't fight like hell, they're going to steal your country from you. So I also know that Donald Trump was in.
By the way,
I'm outside the Capitol waiting for the signal.
Hell yeah, stand back and stand by. Stand by, Dragon Hughes. Wait for the signal.
By the Secret Service, that there were people trying to get into the protest or trying to get into his ellipse speech that were literally.
The thing, if you pump people full, like if I pump out a message that a certain house in my neighborhood is just full to the brim of just like the worst human monsters imaginable, they're child diddlers and serial killers and they like they parallel, they double park, the worst human beings in the world. And I say that again and again and again and again and again, and I spread it and spread it and spread it. And eventually someone takes, matters into their own hand and goes and does something to them, goes and hurts them. After I say, Adam's like, there's nothing we can, if we don't do something quick, they're going to serial murder everyone. Now it could be a lie. It could be a lot of things. In this scenario, if we're comparing it to this, I guess it would be a lie, because we're talking about the election being stolen. If somebody goes in and murders them under the idea that they were serial killers and all this other stuff, how much blame is at my feet for spreading that lie and spreading that rumor? I would say a significant amount. Am I directly responsible? Am I the one who gave the order? No. It's going to be hard to find me criminally liable, but ethically liable? Absolutely.
armed and had guns. The Secret Service said, we can't let them in. Donald Trump said, let them in. They're my friends. I love these people. That's fine. And I also know that after the speech, when Donald Trump told everybody to march to the Capitol, when they were marching, chanting rebellious slogans. They were saying 1776. They were looking to have a rebellion because, as you said, they thought the election was stolen. When they got there and Vice President Pence didn't unilaterally toss the election, what did they do? They said, hang Pence, hang Pence, hang Pence. Pence himself called Trump to complain about this. Trump didn't check in on him a single time that entire day because he was so upset that Pence wouldn't unilaterally toss the election. So when I look at the totality of the events, am I here to say that because he said march to the protest peacefully, that means that it was peaceful? If that was the case, then as soon as Donald Trump saw violence, you know what he would have done? Donald Trump would have made a phone call and he would have said, Miller, why is the National Guard not there right now? What's going on? My daughter-in-law is talking to me. Everybody, or my daughter's talking to me. My chief of staff is talking to me. My lawyers are talking to me. People from Congress are calling me. Everybody's calling me saying violence is happening. Why aren't you guys stopping it? He didn't do that. Instead, what he did was he had a 2-minute conversation with Giuliani, and then Giuliani started ringing up all these congressmen saying, hey, don't you think you guys should delay the vote? Give us 10 days. Right? What is that? Capitalizing on violence to circumvent the constitutional transfer of power from one president to the next, also known as an...
Honestly, Destiny makes a better case than I could. I don't think I've ever made that connection before, at least publicly, because I still have a lot of assumptions that I'm making in my head. But I think, honestly, when it's laid out in that way, it sounds like a safe bet to make on them trying to capitalize on the violence.
Insurrection. It's so clean and it's so easy, and none of the facts that I just gave, by the way.
Because I leaned usually towards the idea that Trump was just happy to see that all burn down, and maybe tangentially under the idea that, oh, maybe it'll turn into something. But knowing that Rudy Giuliani was continuing those calls during that time period, it's pretty bad. I remember reading it a while ago, but I don't think I made the connection.
Glenn will not contest a single one of them, even though all of those facts are in the politically partisan J6 committee. How crazy is that?
Tell me when you're done talking, and I will immediately contest.
Glenn, can you particularly respond to what you said? So, Glenn, can you respond to those, particularly the 2 points?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very surprised that your incredibly substantive discussion on a YouTube channel led to a conclusion that was the most negative possible about a Republican candidate. That would be completely unpredictable. But I'm going to tell you why in everything that you just said. We can get back to the question and be able to answer the question of why it is that Jack Smith did not actually charge Donald Trump with doing what you claim he did, which, had he done, would have been a very serious crime, and I think he should have been charged for. The reason is because in what Donald Trump actually said, as opposed to all the secret meaning that you and your Democratic Party community believe he intended to convey through very banal...
Again, like, we don't have anything that specifically, hey, let's use the fear from the rioters in order to capitalize on it. So making that argument and making that argument with certainty is impossible. But the interests do line up and happen to be very convenient that it happened at that exact time after Rudy Giuliani saw the situation. And then he used the situation, used the violence, that exact moment to do that. Your mind wanders into some scary areas. And hey, if the guy is willing to call for the suspension of the Constitution because he lost the race, having his lawyer take advantage of the violence in order to try to press his case for why he should still be president in the last hours and the last minutes while he's still pissed at everyone and is locked in his room. Yeah, I think that is more than possible.
Donald Trump actually said, as opposed to all the secret meaning that you and your Democratic Party community believe he intended to convey through very banal political slogans like "go fight like hell," is the only thing he actually told them was that they should go and march there and be peaceful when they went and protested. And you know what? The vast majority of people who marched to the Capitol did exactly what Donald Trump told them to do, which was to be peaceful. There were let's say 10,000 or 15,000 people outside the Capitol, and you said before they were yelling, which actually is constitutionally permissible and protected. You're actually allowed to yell at politicians when you're angry about what you perceive to be a political injustice. Of those, a small percentage actually entered the Capitol, and of those, a very small number of people used non-fatal violence against police officers, something that we had watched occur for months through the summer and into the fall.
How many cops died during Euromaidan? That's a good question.
of 2020, over and over and over and over again, when thousands of Americans were injured as part of a nationwide protest movement that repeatedly ended up engaged with the protesters engaging in violence against the police. This, as I said before, I don't regard the Black Lives Matter movement as an insurrectionary movement. I would never call it a coup, but by every metric, it would be so much easier to make that case about the Black Lives Matter movement than it would be about January 6th, in large part, because the number of people actually involved in trying to use violence was very small. Even the people who used violence were not engaged in even the kind of violence that you often expect, which is, again, pulling out guns, shooting people. There was none of that. That's why nobody died on January 6th except for 4 pro-Trump protesters. So yes, there was violence on January 6th. Yes, they were there because they believed that the election was stolen. Yes, they ended up delaying this ceremonial ministerial process by a grand total of 2 hours or 2.5 hours. But while it was a riot perpetrated by a small number of people, it never got even close to threatening the levers of power of the United States, the most militarized country on the planet, and that is why it is an absolute joke to try and put it up there with the major historical events of the United States, let alone the kinds of coups.
Nobody said it's like that type of a coup, or it's like this specific event from American history. The only statement that is being made that it's an insurrection, right? It doesn't have to be the worst insurrection in the world, just that it's an insurrection.
Or attempted coups that take place all around the world that always involve universes greater levels of violence. And
that's not true. That is not true. There again, we talked about it earlier in the show. That attempted coup in Germany was a bigger joke than what happened on January 6th. Unironically, bigger joke than what happened on January 6th. Still considered a coup by Germans,
threats
or an attempted coup by the Germans.
To the status quo than January 6th did.
Wait, so Destiny, just before you continue, I want to go back to what you said because I think it's really important. You made two.
Wait, can I ask one quick question and then you can ask my thing? Glenn, if they would have managed to kill like one lawmaker, would you call it an insurrection then? If they had like killed like Nancy Pelosi, because the government could still continue, like everything could still go on, it's fine.
I mean, I would need some context. Like, was it one rogue guy like who found Nancy Pelosi and shot her? Was it like a huge group of thousands of people dragging her out and hanging her in the public square while the crowd cheered?
If someone was killed,
like, I would need the context.
Oh my God. Okay, sorry, what was your question?
Okay, so let's go back.
There have been politicians killed before, assassinated in the United States before, and we didn't call those insurrections.
Because they probably weren't a group of people trying to prevent the lawful execution of power in the United States.
I would need the which is why I said I would need the context of.
Oh, like a group of people, like Trump's audience trying to circumvent the legal execution of the Constitution? That's like that context? Yeah.
Wait, so let's go back to Destiny. You made two points before, and I want to stick on those because actually good points we need to go over. Number one is Trump's full speech, the context of the speech, and what he actually said. And number two is the National Guard. So let's go back to Trump's full speech, which he started on, Glenn, but let's actually continue on that point. So Destiny mentioned that if you look in the context, he was actually inciting people to go there, not just peacefully. Would you agree that makes sense, or what's particularly your thoughts? Do you think he was just telling people to go peacefully and that was it?
Why didn't he tell them to go home when they were unpeaceful?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Why didn't he tell them to go home when they were rioting?
I'm trying to answer, but since you're talking, I can't. The way I interpret a speech is I look at the words that are spoken by the person delivering the speech. And when someone stands up in front of a crowd and says, I want you to be peaceful when you go on this protest that you're about to go on, that the Constitution permits you to go on, I take that seriously as an instruction given to his followers not to go there and use violence. And the attempt to suggest that, as I said before, phrases that politicians use in almost every political speech, like let's fight like hell and let's get our country back, things that Joe Biden said over and over in the 2020 campaign and many times before, that somehow that was like a secret code to go tell those people that what I really want you to do, even though I just told you to be peaceful, is in fact go and use violence. It's something that you have to be delusional in order to...
Look, I would say I would be more sympathetic to Glenn's argument, and I will say, since it is a lot of things, you're implying a lot of intent here. So I can't bring out like the 100% piece of evidence. Here's the text message from Trump saying this is my exact intent. But I mean, of course, no way anyone would ever engage in this, expressing that much clear intent if they ever want to stay out of a jail cell. But his utilization of it after the fact and just sitting on his ass does leave one's mind to wander. And it is a little worrying that Glenn's mind, as conspiratorial as it often tends to fade into, can't even think up in his mind how Trump could possibly use it that way. Or when he figures it out that Trump did basically do nothing for 3 hours, he just downplays it.
Defined. And apparently that is not what the crowd heard, since the vast majority of the people who went to the Capitol, in fact, did not use violence. Only a very small number did.
So then the easy question, wait, on the back of that, just an easy question then. Yeah. If he, first of all, also, no one is saying he's speaking in secret code. Everybody understood, apparently, loud and clear, to go to the White House and protest. That's why thousands of people, or I'm sorry, the Capitol building protest, that's why thousands of people went in. But the question would be, let's say that I grant all of that. Let's say every single thing you just said is true, and Trump really did just want them to peacefully protest. Why is it that when the rioting had started and people went to him begging him, please, Trump, please tweet and tell these people to go home, why would he not do it?
Well, he did do it. Your argument
after
is that
hours. No, don't lie. Glenn, why are you lying? Why are you lying right now?
Can you shut up and let me answer
but you're
your question?
lying. Okay, go ahead. You can lie. Go ahead.
Just let him respond and then respond afterwards.
I think you've lied probably 100 times. But
really? Name one.
You a liar. What I try and do is go instead.
What have I lied about?
Demonstrate what the actual arguments are, because I don't feel a need to constantly declare myself the winner.
To be clear, you haven't contested a single fact I've given, because I've been correct on everything.
The reason that I believe that Donald Trump delayed.
Man, if Destiny's lied 100 times, it would be very easy. Fun. I mean, it would be very easy. It's just like he's lying over and over and over again. If anything, there's just not enough time for Glenn to make all the points and call out all the things that Destiny has been lying about. So obviously he'll call out at least one.
Telling those people to go home is because for a long time he saw it as a legitimate protest, including people going into the Capitol. So if this entire case now rests on the fact that Donald Trump should have posted a tweet an hour earlier than he should have, and that way the riot would have dispersed after 2 hours rather than 3 hours, I think that illustrates the triviality on which we're actually having this discussion. These kind of reaches to try and say that the reason this was an insurrection and Trump tried to overthrow the government or seize power illegally is because he tweeted an hour after you think that he should have tweeted. That is, I mean, we're talking about the smallest details, because that's all you have.
You're mistaken. You're mistaken. When you say that it illustrates the triviality, that's not true. What it illustrates is how childlike Trump is, that our only expectation would be to pray for him to tweet to send his followers home. What his actual constitution, hours after the rioting had carried on. Donald Trump is the head of the National Guard that ought to have been deployed to DC, and he failed to uphold in his duty to do that. Instead, he sat and he watched and he prioritized his own political career by telling Giuliani to make phone calls to congressmen instead of executing his duty as the commander-in-chief to deploy the National Guard to DC for hours. So you are right in one sense that begging for a tweet is a bit trivial, but what it really trivializes is Donald Trump's competency and the
Can I just also throw out there that we got super lucky on January 6th, and I know that's weird to say, but there were instances where senators were running the wrong way towards the crowd, and then police officers at the last second turned them around. I think that happened to Josh Hawley, and I know that happened to Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney, for sure, he was running the wrong way, and they turned him around. And Mitt Romney would have been probably a figure that crowd would not have liked that much. And we got lucky in a way, because while Trump didn't act in those 3 hours and people did end up dying, it could have been worse. I mean, with the people able to enter the Capitol at will like that, all it would take is one legislator, one congressman, one person to have gone down the wrong hallway and nobody turned them around, for them to get captured, possibly killed, hurt, who knows? And how would the events of the day changed if one of those people in the Capitol had like a knife in his back pocket? Because we're talking about a bunch of people with pocket knives. When we look into that crowd, let's not kid. Stabs them, kills them. How does the dynamics change then? Is now that a legislator has died, is it now an insurrection? I don't think any of this particularly matters, but I do just want to highlight the fact that we got lucky that they didn't get their hands on any of those legislators. Because the beating and attacking of all those cops was so they could get to those legislators. It wasn't that those people particularly hated those cops in particular. In fact, when I was at the Capitol that day, I heard a lot of arguing back and forth between rioters and Trump supporters, like, well, we're back the blue, what the hell? No, these are DC cops, they're different. It was to get to the legislators. So what would have changed if they actually got to the legislators? We know how they went through their offices. We know how they went for their laptops. So in some ways, even though obviously the events of January 6th did damage to our trusted institutions, it was a bad day for the United States. Some ways we did get lucky.
Expectations of him even as a president, because you're right, a tweet would have been trivial and it wouldn't have been enough. He should have taken charge as a president, and 20 or 30 minutes after violence happened, he should have called in the National Guard to stop it. He sat there for an hour after Ashley Babbitt died and watched it rage on before he finally made the tweet telling people to go home. How is that at all?
Was it an hour after she died? I mean, it was a while. It was a while till I saw somebody on the grounds.
Compatible with the president that wanted to be peaceful.
I have a question for you. So I don't mind arguments that Donald Trump should have been faster in deploying the national.
By the way, again, Glenn said he lied 100 times. So any of these lies being mentioned would be
National Guard or dispersing the riots, and the riot would have only been 90 minutes or instead of 3 hours. But let me ask you this question. If in fact Donald Trump were trying to lead a coup and an insurrection in the United States, why did he go at all onto Twitter and tell those people to leave peacefully? Why didn't he go and say, you know what, we're currently seizing control of a corrupt government, and therefore I want even more of you to come to Washington and go join these patriots in engaging in violence? Why did he call it off? Why did he tell them for the third time or the second time that day, don't use violence, be peaceful, and go home? That does not sound to me like the kind of statement that somebody intent on a coup would actually be issuing. I've never heard of a perpetrator of a coup before telling the crowd beforehand to be peaceful and then telling them 2.5 hours later again to go home and be peaceful.
It's because he knew he didn't have the support for it. It's so obvious because Donald Trump doesn't want to actually be caught in the middle of military conflict. Again, he was looking for an
this reminds me, like when Ferguson marched on the Capitol, I don't, like, people called it a coup, but again, I already displayed my difficulty with that term. But I think part of the reason he turned around is because he knew, like, yeah, he could attack Moscow. Maybe he'd capture it even, but he wouldn't take over the country. He just didn't have the influence. And his allies that were supposed to join him possibly, I mean, Surovikin, he got arrested. We haven't seen him since. So I think part of the reason he turned around was because he knew that it probably wouldn't succeed. So that's why I say, even though I think it was a mutiny and an insurrection and an attempt to target the military establishment, the fact that he turned around, I just don't know. I can't say for sure whether it was a coup or not. But him turning around is not a determinant factor as to whether or not it was an insurrection.
Easy win, and he didn't get it, and as he saw that his supporters were failing, eventually, he kind of encouraged them when people were begging, please, tell him to go home, and then he starts tweeting out how Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done instead of telling him to go home. When it looked obvious that his little attempt had failed, he's not going to go out there with an AK-47 and start fighting with his supporters, and he doesn't want to leave obvious, clear evidence on Twitter, guys, go coup the government. So of course he speaks, a little bit out of both sides of his mouth, and he eventually tells people to go home because he failed. It's so obvious, such an obvious reading of the facts.
But he ended up doing exactly the thing that you said a real leader would have done. Your argument is that he did it like an hour late.
No, why do you keep saying 1 hour late? It was like 3 hours after the protest, the rioting had started.
Wait, what would be the strategy then? That like 3 hours after it started, after Ashley Babbitt's been shot and after the politicians had been evacuated, and there was not really, like, the politician wasn't even there to be yelled at anymore. What was the plan? Just hold the Capitol until eventually Trump is president and he can make up some other plan? I mean, I don't know what Trump's plan exactly might have been, but I doubt it was have rioters take up the Capitol building for like 3 months till we find up some alternative plan.
And that's a long time when he's getting, and it's also not just that he waited that time period, it's that when congressional leadership and congressional people were calling him and his family, he was making fun of them. What was it? I think it was even McCarthy that made the phone call where he was like, hey, what's going on with your followers out here? And Trump was like, looks like they're a little bit more mad about the rigged election than you are. Like, holy shit, like, these are insane statements to be making, when instead Donald Trump should be saying, hold on, let me get the National Guard over there. As the guy that's literally in charge of it, it's pretty crazy what's happening right now. I have been tasked as part of my oath to the Constitution.
It's just so far removed from like what any country would ever describe as a coup, what any historian would describe as a coup.
He's just speaking out of his. Okay, I thought we were talking about insurrection. Are we talking about coup? Because the coup doesn't just include that. The coup argument has to do with like what he did in Georgia, what he did with the fake slate of electors, a whole bunch more than just that day. That day alone was an insurrection.
No, well, hold on, wait. You're wrong. Hold on. To be clear, I don't care about any other country. I care about the United States. This is my country. And insofar as what a historian would call a coup or a rebellion, again, you are on an island there. You don't think the Whiskey Rebellion was a rebellion. Not enough people died. You don't think that Fort Sumter would have been an insurrection without the Civil War after it. It's only retrospectively, determined. And also, you think that Donald Trump was an insurrection because he was in charge with insurrection, even though nobody from the Civil War was charged with insurrection. Glenn, you are completely on your own legally here with nobody in your corner.
You've come again. This is what you do. You're alone. Nobody agrees with you.
Talk about the number of people who were violent again, Glenn. Go ahead.
Of talking, I'm gonna let.
This would be the question. What historian would not say that the Whiskey Rebellion was an insurrection? What historian would say that the rebels in question have to have guns in order for it to be an insurrection? It just doesn't.
My statements speak for themselves about what I said about Fort Sumter and your imaginary Fort Sumter that you wanted me to analyze, and all the other things I said. What you just said, I believe, is a complete distortion of what I actually said, but I'm not interested in bickering about that since there's a videotape that everybody can watch and see what I actually said. Yes, the reason why we look at other countries, I don't know if you know this or not, but the State Department...
Why would it be so hard to answer if soldiers and militiamen taking over a fort in order to usurp congressional authority and power, in order to usurp it, to say, no, this thing that used to be controlled by the federal government is now controlled by us. We're in charge now. We're trying to separate here. How would that not be an insurrection? Why does he have to be so difficult about it? Why could he not just accept that would be an insurrection like everybody else would? Why can't that scenario of Fort Sumter, why can't that question be answered? I think the only reason why is if it didn't have any chance of success, then it doesn't meet his arbitrary definition.
Calls what happens in other countries all the time coups and insurrections. They condemn coups and insurrections. Under the law, we punish and impose sanctions whenever a government enters in a way that we call a coup or an insurrection. So we have created a long history of how this term is actually used. And this is what I was saying at the start of our discussion, which is that if all you want to do is have history begin with 2016 and Donald Trump and only look at the United States and partisan politics, then you will end up definitely catastrophizing everything associated with Trump. That's basically what the media has done for the last 7 years, is trying to pick Donald Trump as a never before seen evil. The reality, though, is that there is a long history, which I think is critical to consult with and resort to, about how these words have always been used independent of Trump and prior to Trump, including by the American government that you're a part of, or that is your government because you're an American. There's a long record of how we use these terms, and there is no case in which we would resort to trivialities like the leader waited an hour too long to tell people to go home, or there was a protest that turned into a riot that delayed the certification of an election by 3 whole hours, and now we're going to impose sanctions on countries because we believe that there was some kind of an insurrectionary attempt that was serious in nature. Yes, if you just look at everything in isolation and say, as long as I can prove that some people on January 6th did something bad, which is that framework at the beginning you tried to create, this binary framework, then it means that I win. Then yeah, I agree. You can definitely prove that there were people who did bad things on January.
But to be clear, if I got me and my boys together and we said Maryland is going to be its own thing, and there's 1,000 of us, and we took over Annapolis, and we don't really have a chance of success standing up against the federal government like that, and there's no way the United States is going to let Maryland secede, considering how close it is to the federal, the seat of federal power in Washington, D.C., how many federal employees live in Maryland, and because they don't want to set a precedent. We'd fail, we'd get crushed. Would that not be an insurrection just because we didn't succeed or didn't have a chance of succeeding? Nonsense. Don Taylor, Dylan, you're muted. I know I'm not muted. I know I'm not muted, Don. I can see the bar traveling. Now you guys are trying to juke me out. But the thing is, this is going to backfire because I'm going to see you guys telling me, hey, Dylan, you're muted. I'm not going to believe you. And so I'm just going to keep talking. And then you're not going to hear segments. And you guys will be like, oh, can you repeat that? I'm going to be like, nope, your fault. Boy, you cried wolf scenario.
January 6th. But when you look at it in the context, this context that you insist should be ignored of historically how we've used these terms, both in our own history and in the history of other countries, it is a joke.
Well, when did Destiny argue that the story should be ignored? It was Destiny who brought up the history about the Whiskey Rebellion in the first place.
Try and apply those terms to this 3-hour riot.
Well, so Glenn, let me ask you a question about that. So about the 3 hours, about waiting 3 hours to do the votes, they did it 3 hours later. So instead of a full insurrection, is that at least, could you say that's an attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power?
No, I think it would be a preposterous statement to draw from that conclusion.
What's wrong with his head? How are people look at Destiny's face. Can we take a shot of that, picture of that? I'm sorry, but how are people storming the Capitol building, chanting "Hang Mike Pence" after they came there for the Stop the Steal event, and then the attempt to stop the steal with force? How are you saying, oh, they were attempting to at least stop the transfer of power? They weren't doing that. They absolutely were. We saw them do it. They were yelling that they were doing it the whole time. That's the bare minimum. That's just an acknowledgement of reality. How can you not say that? You're saying that nobody who stormed the Capitol had an intention to stop the transfer of power? What about the people who got a decade in prison for sedition because they were saying, yes, that was our intent? Are those people now lying, or are those court cases built on fraudulent evidence? Or the testimony from those arrested and sentenced saying, yes, we were trying to save our democracy? Were they all just lying? And it was all Glenn? He understands their motives? This is a statement of what Eli just said, that people were trying to stop the peaceful transfer of power. That is what they were doing. That is why they were storming the Capitol. That is just describing the effect. That's like the Germans invaded Poland. You're just describing the events that happened apolitically, with no pejorative terms, just describing what happened.
I think if Trump didn't walk out of the White House peacefully, as he did on January 20th, and had in the interim tried to...
Whether or not it failed does not determine whether or not there was an attempt to stop the transfer of power.
To incite or encourage more violence on the part of the people in the government and in the military who were loyal to him, to engage in violence in a way that he really actually tried to stay in power, then I would be more open, more amenable to the idea that this was actually an attempted coup or an insurrection. The fact that political protests delay important proceedings all the time. That's, in fact, one of the purposes of political protests is to be disruptive.
The purpose of the protest was to stop the steal because they believed the election was being stolen.
Make the people in the government understand that there are people in the citizenry who are angry about a perceived injustice. That is often the goal of political protest. And if the goal of this protest was to delay by a couple of hours...
Does anybody have that footage of those? Can we look at that new J6 footage? Let's bring this up. This is just, I gotta, the ones where they're at the door. New Jan 6. I looked up new Jan 6 footage. It was all a year old. It was released in the last 2 months, I know. No, not that one. Yeah, here it is.
I've never been so heartbroken. For Texas. In the building. Where's your messenger? Or your message? Your text messages? Yeah, it's nothing. I'm not going to.
So if you're asking where they are, they're literally at the doors to the entrance of Congress. They've beaten their way all the way up to the chamber of Congress.
Just type in your phone number.
Here we go. This is where I wanted.
Where are your friends?
Here it is. The area.
Okay. I'm live. I'm at the Capitol. Why is it not the We're trying to get in. We got the glass broken. These are all your patriots. This is our house. This is our house.
Our house. How do you handle this? Open the door, brother. How do you handle it? Come on, man. Open the door.
They're socialist pigs. You're going to kill patriots who put this war together. What's wrong with you? Are you handling it? You got pigs. We got kids. We got kids. We're fighting for today. here because of my son.
Oh, they think they're fighting. I heard she said she's fighting.
You better watch out, boy.
You better watch out.
I can't hear what this guy's saying. Hey, what are y'all saying? We're your friends. Yeah. Why?
I don't think they're going to gas this.
No, we just got pushed up the front. I've never had a ticket in my life. Hold on, man. Ever.
I've never broken.
You want my license number? We're real American citizens. We're sick of this. And we're making it knowing that we're sick of it. Okay?
30 years.
Would you? Huh?
And I've never had people like this.
Say again?
I've been in law enforcement in Texas for 30 years.
Talk a little louder. That's because you've never seen corruption like we have seen this last month.
I'm ashamed.
And I'm ashamed of my Congress people. They don't even stand up for it. They're giving away my grandchildren and your grandchildren's freedom.
You need to back up.
I think all that shattered glass was just them screaming so loud. It must have shattered from them sharing their opinions. Sorry, I just the delusion of what we're talking about. Just come on. How do you think they got there? How do you think they got there? Why do you think they were there?
A certification that is ministerial in nature and that happened on the exact day the Constitution requires it to happen, if that's all we're arguing about, then to me it settles the whole case.
What was the goal of the protesters?
A complete joke.
What were they there to protest?
To make themselves heard. I believe they were there to make
themselves heard about what? What were they there to make themselves heard about?
About the fact that they believed that Donald Trump was the legitimate winner of the 2020 election and that Joe Biden and the Democrats had engaged in fraud in the election in order to win that election.
So they didn't believe So they didn't believe in the outcome of the election. They showed up to protest the outcome of the election. Violence was used, and they delayed the certification of the vote. Right? Do you disagree with any of those facts? All of those happened.
No, I do not. No.
Okay, which one of those four? Okay, we'll go over them again. Okay, you agree that they were protesting the results of the election.
I just said I don't agree. I don't disagree with any of those facts.
He agreed. You agree with all four of those facts. Then what part of this is not an insurrection? What's missing?
The fact that the number of people who engage in violence and the way they engage in violence.
So it has to be more people and it has to be more violent, is the argument.
Was very similar to how protests often turn into a riot. It is universes away from any kind of actual serious threat.
I agree.
To the
Glenn,
power of the United States.
What about the pipe bomb? Was it just because it didn't go off?
We agree that this was a riot. No one is denying this was a riot.
Yes. Right, it was a riot.
Yes,
whenever
it was a riot.
Bring in violence into the political system, and one of the protesters, an unarmed protester, ends up dead, and police officers end up injured. It's a lamentable act. It's something we don't want to encourage. It's a bad.
Dylan, some QAnoners showed me a video of the shaman being calmly escorted around. So once the rioters had already broken through the police line and smashed the windows, they got into the building and the cops were unable to deal with the amount of people because they were understaffed, which everybody understands, everybody agrees on. And so what the cops decided to do, and you can see this from a lot of different videos, and we knew this at the time of the J6 report, and this information was included in the J6 report, is that they would guide people to areas where they could better control them and take them in a direction away from legislators. So that's what they were doing. Some people painted as if they would open the doors and they were just like, okay, everyone, just come in here and we'll arrest you afterwards for no reason. But the reason that they were redirecting people is because it would be easier to control them in other areas than having them all near the legislators.
Thing, but this is so much to me like the inability to say that a foreign government or a foreign leader is doing bad things without Ahmed immediately calling them Adolf Hitler and not understanding that there's a difference between a bad event or a bad person or a bad act and what the Nazis did. Everything has to go to the furthest extreme.
No one is taking anything to a further extreme.
Was a bad, violent riot.
It was a riot. It was a riot.
Nowhere near
it was a riot.
Undermining or subverting the system of law and order in the United States.
It did undermine it.
It did. I mean, if you delay it, and the delay of it was done by violence, then it did undermine it.
It tended to do so.
If somebody delays me getting a promotion, they undermined me getting a promotion.
It did undermine it.
Now that undermining didn't last long, it wasn't successful if I still got the promotion, but you did undermine me getting a promotion.
It was intended to. You said it. You said they went there to protest the election results. It turned into a riot, and they delayed the certification of the vote. every core element.
By a couple of hours.
It doesn't matter. They still did it. That was the goal. That's what they did. They weren't that successful. That's not an argument that it wasn't an insurrection.
If you think that that was the goal, then I think your argument is even weaker than I thought so the first time. If you believe their goal was to delay this ministerial act by Congress to make it happen at 4:30 p.m. instead of 1:30 p.m. or whenever it was scheduled.
Well, no, the goal was to delay it completely.
They intended to do, and that is what they succeeded in doing. Then the idea that that was an insurrectionary intent to delay a ministerial act, a ceremonious act, by a couple of hours so that they could have their grievances heard, then I think it's even a weaker case than I thought so, and having listened to you for 3 hours the first time.
Okay, and that's fine. But historically, whether we're talking the Whiskey Rebellion, which used to be called the Whiskey Insurrection, whether we're talking about Shays Rebellion, whether we're talking about Nat Turner's Rebellion, whether we're talking about any of the insurrections that were protesting and insurrecting against the Fugitive Slave Act, whether you're talking about literally any of these things that were historically all
native revolts as well.
Understood to be insurrections that Congress was talking about in the 50s and 60s where they passed the 14th Amendment. These were all understood to be insurrections. They were all.
Were those coups?
We're not talking about a coup right now. We're talking about an insurrection, aren't we? Who's talking about a coup?
No, coup is a word that we've been using from the very first.
Yeah, but I thought we were talking about insurrection. Okay, these are two separate words, and so when you're trying to build the argument for one, while they overlap in some areas, it's not the same as building the other argument. I was under the assumption we're talking about insurrection right now.
That we started talking.
I'm sorry. I believe that in the beginning of this, Eli. I'm sorry. Pull the tape. Were we talking about defining an insurrection or a coup?
No, it's an insurrection.
I asked you for both. I started.
We haven't even gotten to coup yet. We can get to coup. If you want to get to coup, the electoral slates, that's a way easier argument for me. Okay, but if you're having trouble with this argument, like.
That's certainly something I've been talking about quite a bit, and I've used the word coup many times.
Of course, because you're trying to obfuscate. Yeah,
it's totally fine. So let me ask you: do you think what happened on January 6th rose to the level of an attempted coup?
Firstly, I would say that, just to reiterate in the past, your understanding of insurrection is unique and ahistorical. Just to be clear.
Stop saying that, because it's so untrue and it's so irrelevant. Even if I were the only one who thinks it, it's not proof that I'm wrong. The idea
I didn't say it was proof. I didn't say it's proof that you're wrong.
Agrees with you.
I'm not saying it's proof that you're wrong. I'm just saying.
Not everyone on your side. Not everyone is on your side, Destiny. Even though I know you sit on a YouTube channel with Democrats and people who tell you that you are. There's a much bigger world than your YouTube channel.
Yeah. So the actual the coup part. If I were to look at coup, or call it a self coup, I guess, since Trump was still in power, the coup part is going to be Donald Trump on 2 or 3 different forks. One is going to be trying to bully at least 7 different state legislatures or electoral bodies to change the results of their electoral votes, knowingly that he was working with false evidence, because every single person that he entrusted to gather data about voter fraud had told him prior to the statements he made about these things that the voter fraud wasn't real. That would be the first part. The second part.
Can you just answer first? Is what happened on January 6th an attempted coup? I realize there's other things.
This is the I'm getting it. This is the culmination. The second part is the electoral slates scheme, where Donald Trump and his people basically contacted 7 different slates or 7 different states and got all these people involved in making and testifying to falsely being electors of these states to be sent to Congress, and then I guess the climax of that would have been in Congress, Donald Trump asking Pence, when he gets these fake slates of electors, to ignore the real electors, say that these particular electors, it's too hard to figure out what's going on.
By the way, I'm looking at the Whiskey Rebellion right now, because I haven't studied this in high school. The first line is the Whiskey Rebellion, also known as the Whiskey Insurrection. Just throwing out there. But if you look at the casualties, so 3 to 4 rebels died. And no American soldiers died, but 12 died of illnesses. So they had their own Bryant sickness. Okay, again, it's not the same thing. But if it's like, oh, well, you know, it has to have a good attempt at succeeding. I mean, then, and only 4 died. But this is still considered by historians to be an insurrection. So when the argument is made that Glenn Greenwald's definition of insurrection is different than the historical definition of insurrection used by most historians, that is true.
On, and then throw it to the House to have the House essentially, because the Republicans were
like, the success is not a determining factor at all, or possibility of success.
Controlling the parts of the House they needed basically in order to elect Donald Trump as the president, for them to make a determination on the election. That part was an attempted self coup, yes, because he was
So you do think your argument is also that it's an attempted coup, not just an insurrection. I don't know why you got
because the self coup part. I'm explaining, because the coup part is fundamentally separate from the insurrection part. There were 2 different things going on that day.
All right, let me because I think it's a good point to kind of like summarize. We've been going almost 2 hours, which is like what we said was our kind of target goal. But so let me just tell you about all of that, my view of what all those events are, which is that, as has happened before in elections, in American elections, when people perceive.
So I'm reading it again. So apparently Washington came up with his army to like fight the rebels, and they all just went home. Like 3 or 4 died, and other. So, again, if we're using Glenn's definition, then this wasn't an insurrection then, right? It wouldn't count as an insurrection because it didn't have a chance of success, and they backed down.
Or believed that there was fraud in the election, and the illegitimate winner was certified, and the legitimate winner was declared the loser, as has happened previously. Trump exercised all of his legal recourses. He was the leader of the executive branch, and he went to the 2 other branches of government, first to the courts, and then when that failed, to the Congress, using a theory that some lawyers had told him, and I don't mean like personal injury lawyers that he picked for that reason.
No,
I mean lawyers who had previously been regarded.
God, there's still 20 minutes in this? Oh my God, this is long. Well, we're almost there anyway, so we got to make it to the end.
As some of the most prominent and prestigious lawyers like Rudy Giuliani, not by me, but by many people, celebrated for many years, and John Eastman, people like that, had told him that this was a role the vice president had. There was an incident in 1960, albeit different, that could have suggested that
I'm sorry, but there is no argument to be made. At least if you ask most legal scholars, I haven't seen somebody legitimately try to argue that the vice president of the United States can just wholeheartedly disregard the electors sent by states and then be like, and then send it back to the states. He did not have the power to do that. Congress could have the power to like reject and send it back to the state, but that's Congress's power. That's not his power.
That was part of the vice president's duty. He went to Congress in order to appeal to.
His duty is to oversee the process.
The legislative power, and when that failed, when he exercised all of his legal options in the judiciary and failed, and then exercised his recourse in the Congress and failed, he walked out of the White House on January 20th before noon peacefully and turned over peacefully the levers of power to the certified winner of the 2020 election, which was Joe Biden.
Real quick, just on that explanation,
what
happened in 1960 that was comparable to this event?
There was a dispute about which candidate had won Hawaii, whether it was Richard Nixon or John Kennedy. First, Richard Nixon was declared the winner. Then John Kennedy, on a recount, was declared the winner as the certified.
And then the presidency drew up a fake slate of electors, and they called the Hawaiian Secretary of State, and they said, "You better make sure I find enough votes to make." Oh, did that? I'm sorry. I thought since you were making that comparable.
Vote. They sent both slates of electors to the Congress, and Richard Nixon, presiding over the Senate, like Mike Pence, serving in that function, declared that the real winner of Hawaii was John F. Kennedy. The reason I say it's not comparable is because in that case, the state had certified
exactly
the last resort.
Yeah, that's great. So I mean, I was hoping that you didn't know that. The fact that you know that is even more disingenuous then, because the issue with Donald Trump's slates of electors.
I'm gonna explain to you why I cited that as the only example. I want to be clear. I don't agree with the legal theory.
But you just cited it and you didn't explain it any further until I asked you.
Because you interrupted. Had you not?
No, you were done. You moved way past it. I let you move past it.
No. The relevance is that the reason why there were well-qualified actual members of the bar who had long been advising Donald Trump on a whole bunch of legal matters had come up with this theory was because that was the one time in history after 1876 when the Electoral Act and the procedures were implemented when there was an actual dispute about which slate of electors should be chosen. And Richard Nixon, serving as the presiding officer of the Senate, was widely complimented because he actually acknowledged that the winner of Hawaii was not himself but was John Kennedy, implying that he had some discretion about which to choose. The reason I immediately said that it wasn't comparable, and it's the reason I never thought Mike Pence had the authority to do what Donald Trump believed he had the authority to do, was precisely because Richard Nixon was duty-bound to choose the actual certified winner of Hawaii, which is what he did. Nonetheless, he was complimented because he did have the ability to choose otherwise. If Mike Pence had done what Donald Trump had requested that he would do, and that some lawyers told him Mike Pence had the duty to do, I have no doubt about what would have happened, which is that that would have then gone to the Supreme Court and asked the Supreme Court whether or not Mike Pence in fact had the authority to do what he did. The Supreme Court would have ruled there was no inclination that the Supreme Court had to interfere and to make Donald Trump the presidency. They had the president. They had several opportunities to do and refrain. He would have lost in the Supreme Court, and he would have left office just as he did once he exhausted all of his appeals in the other two branches of government, and left peacefully on January 20th. The fact that Trump left peacefully on January 20th is, to me, the most dispositive fact. And
why does that necessarily matter? If someone struggles and goes around the law and goes against the Constitution, does everything they can to change the results, but then fail, and then after failing, with their popularity at like 28%, and no chance of staying in office, they leave. What was the other option? Let's say Trump was a coup guy. Let's say he genuinely, once he lost, he was like, how do we overthrow? And he tries everything and he fails. What if it was a coup guy, if he was like a really big coup guy, instead would he have gotten a machine gun and said, you're gonna have to remove me? Which I remember during that period when he was fighting the results of the election, there was a question about whether we would have to physically remove Donald Trump from the White House, which was embarrassing in and of itself that we had to have that conversation. But I mean, what would be the way that Trump would leave that would prove that he was in favor of an insurrection or wanted a coup? Would it only be proven if he tried to use the armed forces or took a gun himself?
It was a fact that will never change. It will always be true in history, and I think will make the attempts to depict what happened as part of the 2020 election as some sort of serious insurrection or serious attempted coup nothing short of laughable.
That's fine.
Now, there's a lot of people who hate Trump enough. They're willing to believe anything about him, but I think ultimately that's how it will be understood.
That's fine. I'm sorry, a failed coup is still a coup. Whether you leave afterwards because it failed it doesn't change the fact that the coup attempt was...
I don't think it rises to that level. I don't think
that's great, but you're literally willing to retroactively analyze whether Fort Sumter was an insurrection based on the events that came after. You would change that.
Let's not go...
I was double muted. I don't even understand that. Dude, I don't even understand what they're debating at. It's just the same points over and over and over again at this point. They could have ended this an hour ago. But we're gonna stick it through.
That we've already
I understand. Yeah, I know. The facts are hard. But hold on, just in response to what he said. So in response to what he said, I know you're upset. I know facts are hard. I know. I'm sorry. So the reason why I'm upset that you brought up 1960 and why I'm even more upset now that you know the details of it is because the issue was never that multiple slates of electors were sent, because state legislatures almost certainly have the ability to do that. The issue was that Hawaii sent 2 sets of electors because it was legitimately an incredibly close. I think it was off by like 140 votes. I understand that you did. But the issue with what Trump did was they had electors in these 7 states falsely attest that they were authorized and duly elected by the state assemblies in order to send their electoral votes to Congress. That was a lie. It was perjury. They were encouraged to do it by people under Trump, and they did it on a bullshit legal theory from Eastman that everybody knew was bullshit. And they literally, yeah, you can always find one
Rudy
crazy
Giuliani and not Sidney Powell.
That's great, and I'm sure I can find a doctor that'll tell me that acupuncture will cure my diabetes. Okay, just because you have one person.
I don't agree with those lawyers. The point is Trump had lawyers telling him it was a valid.
Trump had.
He lost.
Let me finish my point. Let me finish my point. The issue is that these electors transmitted their votes to Congress falsely. They lied, and they were encouraged by Trump's campaign to lie. They were not authorized by the state assemblies like they were in Hawaii in 1960 to do so, which is why the comparison is insane. And by the time those electoral votes got to Congress, the plan from Trump, the plan from Eastman at that point, wasn't to say that Pence could declare a winner after the legitimate negotiations had happened in Congress over whether or not these electoral slates were real. The goal was to say, Pence was going to just say, hey, actually, I don't know where these came from. We're just going to go ahead and throw it to the assemblies in the House and let them decide, which Republicans had 26 and Democrats had 24 state assemblies, which would have meant that Donald Trump arguably could have won the election. This is undoubtedly a self-coup. Nobody Nobody thought this legal theory was valid. Even Eastman called it highly into question multiple times during some of the memos that he sent himself. And the only 3 lawyers that Trump took advice from, in opposition to his actual qualified lawyers, were Eastman, Giuliani, and Powell, who are so much clowns. Even people like Tucker Carlson were texting back and forth with Fox News execs saying how annoying it was that Sidney Powell was making claims that they had to carry on the network because everybody knew that she was full of shit.
Rudy Giuliani spent most of his adult life as one of the most revered lawyers.
It is really, I gotta say, if you really want to get some of that hot Republican tea, the hot drama, you go back and you read those Tucker Carlson texts from around January 6th. You will not find somebody who hates Trump more than Tucker Carlson during that month.
Execs saying how annoying it was that Sidney Powell was making claims that they had to carry on the network because everybody knew that she was full of shit.
Rudy Giuliani spent most of his adult life as one of the most revered lawyers and political figures in the United States, to the point where people thought when he ran for president in 2008 that he was deemed the front runner.
And then he gave us,
and then he became like the Boogie 2998 of the like lawyer world, right? He was once beloved and great and wholesome, and then what did he do? And like everybody associates with Trump, it got worse and worse and worse and worse.
Point where people thought when he ran for president in 2008 that he was deemed the front runner.
And then he gave a speech in front of the Four Seasons Landscaping Company.
I never thought so. I always have despised Giuliani. But the way the criminal law works is very often if a defendant is charged with some sort of criminal intent and they can prove that they had actual lawyers who were advising them that what they were doing it was legal, that goes directly to their intent of whether or not they understood. Wrong. You have no idea what you're talking
dead
about.
Wrong.
Destiny. I practiced law for so many years. If you can prove that you have lawyer letters telling you that what you've done is actually legal and is highly relevant in a court of law as to whether or not you had criminal intent, because people are expected.
That's good. I didn't see that. Henry Kissinger was a revered diplomat. How could you say? How could you say?
To rely on the advice of their counsel to understand what the law is. I think Trump's theory, for the reason that I explained well before you took 10 minutes to do so, was baseless. But he thought it was valid because he had lawyers who were telling him that it was.
You're right. Okay, that's okay. Maybe you're right there. You're the lawyer and I'm not. Can you tell me what is it called if I do a thing with a lawyer where we both make a plan to break the law? What is that called, Glenn?
Oh, if you have lawyers who are giving not only deliberately false advice, but false advice that the client knows is false, just to create a fraudulent scheme that you had legal counsel, that then will of course be relevant to the question of whether or not that person had criminal intent. But in this case, these lawyers were not, again, these were not personal injury lawyers that he just pulled off the street and paid a bunch of money to write a letter that he told them to write.
He went out and found the lawyers that would agree with him after everybody else told him that there was no evidence, and there was no evidence, and he found no evidence, and could find no evidence, and had to try to create evidence, which is why he called the Georgia Secretary of State and tried to manifest corruption, try to manifest fraud, try to manifest the votes. Like, yeah, he just found the people who could tell him, yes, you will be president. After he said, no matter if I lose, it's rigged, which is what he said going into this election. It was always the plan that if he loses, to deny it. When has he ever lost an election that he accepted? And I'm not even just talking about generals. I'm talking about primaries. Go back to the Republican primary in 2015 and watch how he reacts to every loss. He cannot accept it.
Lawyers who had operated at the highest levels of the United States government, who had been regarded as highly prestigious lawyers who graduated.
But they're also indicted in some cases as co-conspirators. So if they're indicted as co-conspirators, you can't use the fact that they're giving you legal advice because you seek them out for that particular legal advice, trying to break the law. You can't use the excuse that their lawyer's giving you advice. It is literally one of the key exceptions to attorney-client privilege, Glenn.
He had not been accused of that. They had not been accused of fraud.
They hadn't been accused of it when they were breaking the law. That's normally how breaking the law works. Yes, correct. Usually when you're in the process of breaking a law, you're not being accused currently of doing it. But he was working at advice that was being...
At the time, if you look at it from Trump's perspective, which is what the law is required to do, to determine not whether he was wrong.
I was muted again. I don't know what's up with this mic. I think it's, I think I might have to just get a new mic. But somebody said in chat that Destiny said Rob Noor is a better debater than Glenn Greenwald on this. And I think that's probably true. Either just through a better knowledge of the minutia, either through a better knowledge of like all of the specific court details that not everybody knows, or just from hyper-focusing on it. But also, I just think he's more persuasive generally. Maybe he's less presentable. I don't know about presentability. I'm less presentable than Glenn. But I do think you could probably debate. I'd agree with that after having enough talks with Rob.
In the theory that he embraced, but whether or not he knew that it was illegal and pursued it anyway, the fact that he had not only various members of the bar, but 3 lawyers who had long been regarded as highly prestigious, who graduated some of the best law schools in the country, who, in the case of Rudy Giuliani, was one of the most revered public figures for decades in the United States. I believe he was Time Man of the Year once. He was as celebrated as you will ever find after 9/11. He had actual lawyers who were giving him this advice, writing legal memos about why Mike Pence had that theory. When Mike Pence concluded otherwise, Trump accepted his defeat and left the White House peacefully. He had resorted to all the legal recourses that he believed he had, that lawyers told him that he had, and when those were exhausted and he lost, he didn't order the military to keep him in power. He walked out of the White House.
So then what?
I love the standard for Trump now. Yes, he might have done the fake electors. Yes, he might have called the Georgia Secretary of State and asked him to overturn the results of the election and get the exact amount of votes that he was short by. Yes, he had these plots with Rudy Giuliani. Yes, they wrote up executive orders to seize voting machines. Yes, they were trying to ask the Vice President of the United States to do something he didn't have the authority to do. But he didn't order the army to fire tank shells at Congress. So does it really count?
So you're a fan of using one sentence to incriminate somebody or exonerate them. When Pence and Trump were talking, and Trump said, when Trump said,
what did you say?
You said you're a fan of using one sentence to either exonerate or convict somebody, I guess, because when Trump said march peacefully, you think that's okay. So the peaceful thing completely exonerates Trump from the hour-minute rile-up that he did before the insurrection. That's fine. When Trump was
Dog, I'm sick of people with the pens and the holding the pens in debates. I've seen this with the hosts too long. Everybody, okay? If you got to hold something during the debate, either got to become a smoker or not hold anything during the debate. No more pens, either cigarettes or pipes. The only thing you should be allowed to hold during the debate. We need to bring this 1950s style black and white.
Was talking to Pence, and Trump said, "You're too honest, Mike," after asking for like the 50th time to decide the election on his own. What did Trump mean when he said that?
I have no idea if
That is a great question. Oh my God. Wait, I'm sorry. I got to hear that
Completely
again.
exonerates Trump. When Trump said march peacefully, you think that's okay. So the peaceful thing completely exonerates Trump from the hour-minute rile-up that he did before the insurrection. That's fine. When Trump was talking to Pence, and Trump said, "You're too honest, Mike," after asking for like the 50th time to decide the election on his own, what did Trump mean when he said that?
I have no idea if that's being conveyed accurately. I have no idea what Trump's intention was, but we have all kinds of evidence that Trump vehemently believed that the advice he was given by lawyers was advice that he found persuasive. It wasn't just whispered to him, it was conveyed to him.
Trump in 2015 said if he lost, it was rigged, and when he did lose, he would blame it on all these other things. I remember he lost to other people, and he would say, "Oh, they cheated in this way, so actually I'm the winner." When he won the election in 2016, he still cast out in it, saying, "Yes, I won, but I also won the popular vote. It was millions of illegals that made me lose." Going into 2020. He was saying that if he loses, it's rigged. Then he loses, declares it rigged, calls for the suspension of the U.S. Constitution. It sounds like for Trump, it's impossible either for A, for him to accept that he loses, or B, that he just doesn't want to lose. So therefore, he's going to try to achieve staying in power no matter what. But in effect, what's the difference? If in effect, either A is attempting to overthrow the system purposely because he knows he lost, but he wants to stay in power, or B, he genuinely believes he can't lose an election. The damaging effect on a democracy is the same, and it's going to be very hard to distinguish from an effects point of view the difference between these two things and how he will try to overturn the results of the election. It poses the same essential threat to democracy.
Him in the form of legal memos of the kind that lawyers write all the time.
I don't think essential was the right word. Poses the same risk to a democracy, though. I'm trying to get rid of unnecessary words. I'm noticing that a lot of streamers in the space use big Latin words a lot, and I'm starting to notice it more and more and more. And I've only noticed it more that I read Orwell's article on politics in the English language, so I'm trying to get better about it.
Not
to lay
true.
out the arguments, and there were
Not
not
true.
just 3 lawyers in the United States.
Eastman
who believed
literally
in that
thought
theory.
that
There
their
were
little
other people
scheme.
as well.
Eastman
It's
literally
definitely
thought their
true
scheme would
that-
get overturned at the Supreme Court. He knew it was bogus legal theory. He literally had said this, and they were just trying to buy time for their coup. That was the whole point.
Because Trump, yes, exactly, because Trump believed that there was actual fraud in the election. He wanted more time to be able to find the proof of that
Yes,
fraud.
I agree. You're
And
justifying
it
the
is-
insurrection. He wanted to
and
coup
it
the
is
government
true.
because he thought they stole it from him.
That's proof that it's not an insurrection. He knew it was going to end up at the Supreme Court. Had Mike Pence, you keep trying to invent false histories.
No,
I
you're
don't blame
giving
you.
like a
The
mens
actual
rea for
history is
insurrection.
not-
He thought the election
actual
was
history-
stolen, therefore he could try to flip the
The
election.
mens rea is vital in every single criminal prosecution. If you don't have mens rea, you don't have a crime.
That's literally not
What
true
was
because
in
strict
Trump's-
liability crimes can be convicted with no
Unless
mens rea.
you have-
But
yes,
okay.
Unless you have, which are the tiny minority of prosecutions.
Sure, that's fine, but mens rea is
what-
not. Just because you didn't know you're doing an insurrection doesn't save you from the fact of the matter of it being an insurrection and you being held to account for every single thing related to it.
These are empty arguments. This is just.
Well,
saying
we'll
it
see
wasn't
when
an
it goes to court, I
insurrection and
guess.
Trump didn't know that it was an insurrection.
Wait, Glenn.
At the-
I
yeah.
think we've gone around quite a bit. We've probably gone everything. What time do you want to finish? Because it's been around 2 hours.
Honestly, unless there's like, we haven't discussed the issue of like what the FBI role is, although we did talk about the fact that the FBI had informants on the ground. I don't really need to go into Ray Epps, a thing I've never really been a fan of. I do think there's a question about why the FBI didn't know.
We just don't have any evidence that Ray Epps is a Fed. It's all just he texted somebody that he was involved in organizing what happened that day. That he texted like a nephew. That's all we have.
know more, or if they did know more, but I feel like we debated that a lot in the first debate, which was 3+ hours. I feel like we're kind of at the end of the discussion. It's been just a little over 2 hours, so I'm fine in ending it here unless Destiny feels like there's some really pressing issue that we haven't covered.
No, I think this is. What do you think about the whole elector scheme?
I think Trump believed that there was an actual good faith reason to believe that there was fraud committed in the election.
How do we know that how do we determine that he genuinely believes that? And again, what if he does genuinely believe that every time he loses it's rigged or it's all like if he loses going into 2024, do you think he's going to accept it or do you think he's going to reject the results? He's going to reject the results. I don't need to like guess it for you guys. I'm telling you, he's going to reject the results if he loses. Of course, when he wins, it's always fine. Unless he loses the popular vote, then that's also rigged.
And he was told that.
Like if at the end of the day, he strangles a democracy in the same way, it should be treated as a similar threat. And it's in effect the same thing.
If you submit various electors that would buy them the time to find the proof that they hadn't yet found.
So you think that as long as Trump thought there was fraud, he was authorized to do basically whatever he wanted as long as he could find a lawyer that agreed with him?
No, I believe that entitled him to exhaust every legal recourse in the other two branches of government, which is what he actually did. And once those recourses were exhausted and he lost them all, as he did, his obligation was to do what he did, which was to walk peacefully out of the White House on January 20th as part of the peaceful transition of power to Joe Biden.
Do you think the fake electors were
That's
legal?
the actual
Having people
history.
testify to being electors when they're not? You think that's okay? Because
Yeah,
he
to
thought
be clear, the plan was for them to lie. You're saying that Trump believed that he had the legal recourse to make people purposefully lie to the government and say that they were the nationally chosen electors, chosen by the state to represent the votes of the people. You think that Trump believed that he had the legal right to have these people go and lie? It was meant to cause confusion, which they would then benefit from, throw back to the states, and then make him president.
thought that maybe there was election fraud. He could have those people lie about being the duly elected electors or appointed electors.
I mean, I contest that characterization, but I also think
It is. They're not the duly elected electors. If they declare themselves to be, then it's a lie. They are lying.
that
Which,
it would
what do
have
you
been
contest
part-
on that?
How would they even be? What vote took place to make them the electors? What institution made them the electors? Who outside of Rudy Giuliani chose those people to be the electors? It wasn't the voters. It wasn't the state of Colorado or the state of Florida or any of the states that they were representing. It was Trump's team. And if it's set, if the standard is set that you could just get a bunch of whoever who's at what's-its from any state and say, sure, they're the elector, now we have to send it back to the states, then it no longer becomes a contest of who has the most, you know, electoral college votes. It becomes a contest of who controls the most state houses. Or it could become that, which I think would be very dangerous.
What would have been that it would have been part of what would have been contested as part of the judiciary. All of this would have ended up in the court. You want to create this false history about how if Mike Pence had done something that he didn't actually do, what Trump would have done. My belief is that Trump would have left the White House on January 20th, no matter how many other proceedings he ended up resorting to. There was the Supreme Court there, even though people were claiming that Amy Coney Barrett had only gotten this position because of a promise that she made to vote for Donald Trump in the election. None of that ever happened. In the real history, in the actual history, once Trump lost everything that he tried in the legal process, he left office peacefully. And that is
if
the
he would have delayed,
that I believe defeats everything you say will never change.
Gotcha. So if he would have managed to delay the certification of the vote by, let's say, a month because the Supreme Court case they wanted to wait for whatever reason, and then they do the electoral investigation, they find out there's no fraud, and then he leaves peacefully after staying in office longer than he should have for a few weeks, would that have been okay?
I mean, you're just, again, you're trying to create false histories.
This was Trump's plan. This was his plan. This isn't a false history. We're just saying what would have happened if Trump went further with his plan. Oh, a false history. We're just asking you, what was Trump attempting to do? If you want to obfuscate about what the true intentions of Trump here, that suggests to me, like, you know, a lot of, what was it that Orwell said? I'm sorry, that essay really fucked me up. It was, I think, insecurity in your position is the ally of, you know what? I'll let this keep playing. I'm going to go find it and read it. It was a good line.
That's literally what he was trying to do.
If Trump convinced the Congress that there was sufficient evidence of fraud, that a month was required to investigate the evidence of fraud that Congress believed had there, and they wanted to delay it by a month, and then Congress went back and certified the actual results of the election, and then Trump left peacefully on January 20th, my view would be the same. As long as Trump confined himself to appealing to the other two branches of government and did not try and use his command of the military or his command of the other armed parts of the government to keep himself in power, words like coup and insurrection are things that only MSNBC fans get excited about and believe. And I think it's the reason why Trump is leading in all the polls, because people obviously don't think that what Trump did rose to a level of criminality, even to keep him out of the White House, much less to put himself in jail.
And then when Trump told his Justice Department, when he told Clark to go and talk to, I think it was the acting AG Rosen and then the acting deputy AG Donahue, that you guys need to write a letter to the state saying we have all this evidence of election fraud, and that if they refused, Clark told Rosen that he basically...
Here it is. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. That's the line. Great line.
Be fired and he'd be made acting attorney general. And when that same scheme was brought up in the Oval Office, and I think half of the White House staff threatened to quit if Trump went through with it, do you think that any of that was improper? Asking his Department of Justice to lie to the states about election fraud?
If you believe, as I do, that Trump's contention that the 2020 election was pervaded with all sorts of fraud and that he was the legitimate winner of the 2020 election, asking his Justice Department to find that evidence and telling them that he would fire them if they refuse looks a lot different in its intent than if you begin with the assumption that you are beginning in, that Trump knew that he lost and that everything he was trying to do was an attempt illegally to stay in power. And as I've told you many times, that narrative that Trump was willing to do anything, even outside the law, as long as he could stay in power, is completely contradicted by not only the things that he did do, but by, more importantly, the things that he didn't do. And that you can try and create every alternative history that you want. It's very difficult to analyze hypotheticals like that where we don't have any context or any details for what happened. I can look at the events that happened in real life, and those culminated with Donald Trump not calling in the military, not trying to rile up the armed factions of the government as he could have done. Certainly, a lot of them would have been loyal to him. He could have caused a lot of violence, a lot of internal conflict, maybe even a civil war in order to stay in power. He did none of that.
Who knows? It could be because he saw the odds were against him once all of his legal shenanigans failed.
And he transferred power peacefully to Joe Biden in the way that has been done since the beginning of the Republic.
Do you think Donald Trump, does he bear any responsibility at all for what happened on January 6th?
I mean, he has responsibility, but not in a way that could ever be legal. I mean, he clearly riled up that crowd. He got people riled up. I mean, Rachel Maddow and Bernie Sanders
earlier, didn't he say that he didn't get them riled up, that he was telling them to be peaceful and stuff?
once riled up one of their fans.
I'm not asking about Maddow or Bernie Sanders. I know we like to pivot. I'm just saying, do you think Trump at all, does he have any culpability?
The responsibility is clear, by the way. If you pump somebody's head full of lies that they use to then attack the Capitol, who gave them the lies, I think, yeah, they're responsible.
The reason I'm going to bring up analogies, even
maybe not directly responsible in every violent act, but I mean, without them, the equation wasn't possible.
They shouldn't.
Well, it's because you don't want to actually say something bad about Trump, because you need to be partisan.
It tests whether or not you actually have any consistency.
I have all the consistency in the world.
Wait, Glenn, you mentioned that.
I think if he's going to keep, if he wants to prolong this by asking me questions, I'm going to insist on the right to answer the questions in the way that I actually want. And if that means bringing up analogies or metaphors,
sure. Here, I can help with the analogies. If anybody else did the same thing that Trump did on J6, I'd say it's an insurrection.
I'm only going to. We're kind of like at the point where it's an interrogation. I'm kind of am flattered that Destiny seems not to want to end. So he's just kind of now asking me a bunch of questions, which I'm happy to engage.
Wait, what does this read? He's asking me questions in a debate. I'm so flattered.
For a little bit longer, provided that I'm able to answer the questions without constantly being interrupted.
All right.
A lot of people have inspired other people to commit crimes. Rachel Maddow and Bernie Sanders, as I said, once got a Democrat, a liberal fan of theirs, so riled up in the belief that the Republicans were fascist and in bed with the Kremlin that one of them actually went in their names and shot up Republican congressmen to try and kill as many of them as he could, and almost killed Steve Scalise. So if you were to ask me, did Rachel Maddow and Bernie Sanders...
So the debate isn't done, but we did a poll in chat with 245 votes. Who won the debate? 8% says Glenn, 91% says Destiny. Well, Glenn could, if he wants, make his own slate of electors to challenge the result, though. That's up to him.
Do anything to cause that person to go and do that, I would say yes, but not in a way that they bore any blame. They got people riled up, and sometimes if you get people riled up, some of them are going to go and commit crimes. The Supreme Court has said you can never be held liable for what other people do as a result of being inspired by your speech. So yeah, if you go around and...
Well, I'm not saying he's criminally liable due to the speech, but the question was about just general responsibility. I do think he has... If you lie to, if you make people think that an asteroid's coming and everybody panics and they start crashing because they're gonna die and then an asteroid doesn't come, like yeah, they hold responsibility for being dumb enough to go panic and waste their lives doing this or doing that, but you hold responsibility for spreading the lie that caused the chaos.
And constantly claim that the election results were the byproduct of fraud. I think it's predictable that some people might engage in violence. It's the kind of thing that you might even think, if it really happened, violence might even be justified. But I don't think that Donald Trump did anything illegal or anything that could be prosecuted, which is why, again, Jack Smith did not charge him with inciting an insurrection, because there's nothing in what Trump said that was anything other than constitutionally protected.
Wait, so Destiny, I think what Glenn said is really what lies at your whole basis of the argument, was that Trump did not tell them exactly to go into the Capitol. But like what Glenn said is he heated up the crowd, he did heat up the crowd, and he did talk about false election, which did incite them, although he didn't actually tell them to do that. That's what Glenn...
He told them to go peacefully. That's what he told them.
He also said to fight like how they're stealing your country.
But wait a second, Glenn, did he not just say he heated up the crowd?
Yeah, he heated up the crowd because... A lot of crowds you're allowed to heat up crowds. I've heated up crowds before by saying, oh, look, the NSA is spying on you in a way that's unconstitutional. Now, maybe some of those people might have been motivated to go to the NSA and try and plant a bomb because I heated them up. But it wouldn't mean that I was responsible. The only thing that Trump said about violence and whether it should be used on January 6th was, don't do it. Go to the Capitol and be peaceful. Obviously, they were agitated and riled up as a result of a political speech. That's what you want to do in a political speech. You want to agitate people and get them riled up about an injustice that you're there to speak about. That's what every good political speech does.
One final question. I'm so curious on this. For Trump legitimately thinking that there was voter fraud, legitimately thinking that the election was stolen. So despite the fact that his all of his campaign people, I think Bill Stepien is field director, despite the fact that Chris Miller from intelligence agency, despite the fact that William Barr, his attorney general, despite the fact that all of these people that he trusted in his government, I think Pence and his team looked into it, everybody that he trusted to look into election fraud, they all said that it wasn't there, and he still said it was there. What would it take for you to be convinced that Donald Trump was knowingly repeating false claims about the election, and he was only repeating them so that he could stay in power? What would you need to actually prove his state of mind there?
I think we already have the intention from his record of how he talks about elections, but I think I'm curious to see Glenn's answer here.
First of all, you were the one who said earlier that the reason why Trump didn't order the military, the intelligence community to act to protect him is because they were essentially trying to subvert him. You even said that he was basically alone, that no one was on his side in the government.
If he tries to violate the Constitution and go against the document they swore to protect, yeah, they probably would not follow orders.
That even the people surrounding him in the military intelligence community didn't actually trust him. So I'm not surprised that he didn't find those arguments or their conclusions persuasive, because he understood that a lot of people in government were there to subvert him.
It was everybody in his government, let's be clear. It was literally everyone in his government.
As Darren Beatty said to you, who worked in the Trump White House and knows a lot of people who knows Trump well and who himself knows Trump well, I don't think there's a single person who knows Trump well who doubts that Trump actually believed that there was fraud in the election. Now, maybe that's because he's so psychologically invested in his ego that he actually can't believe that he would have actually lost an election. Maybe it's because he had really become convinced that the entire American establishment was so corruptly aligned against him and willing to do anything and everything to remove him from power. Maybe it's because Democrats have cheated before in elections, like I said in 1960.
Again, I still, if there's two scenarios here. The one where Trump is usurping the election because he wants to win, he doesn't believe he won. You know, that line he said, like, oh, you're too honest, Mike. That type of Trump, where he just wants to stay in power. And so all those statements before where he's saying, if he loses, it's rigged, all of that was in service of that. And then there's the other Trump who believes it. But again, if the end result is still both of them trying to take illegal mechanisms to usurp the U.S. Constitution and the authority they have to go around the vote and make up fake electors and schemes in order to usurp the vote of the people. And he's going to either attempt to do that every time he goes near the White House and loses, that what from an effect standpoint is different here if Trump wanted to just usurp all the power, or if Trump literally just could never accept the loss if him or his guy lost. Like, the effect's going to be the same. If he wants to usurp power and he's going to do a coup, then he's going to do a coup if he loses for real and he believes it. And if he can't believe it, then the same effect. Either way, it's toxic. It's acidic to our democracy.
60, there's probably other times as well.
Because they cheated in 1960, the Hawaii thing?
I mean, I wasn't around then, but there's a lot of historians who believe that the Daley machine in Chicago, got John Kennedy the election in Illinois. I mean, I'm not saying I believe that, but that is something that
let's say that what you're saying is true, that he didn't trust any of these people. Wasn't the reason why he didn't trust them because he asked them to find election fraud and they said no? Doesn't that show that
he had started to trusting them previously? There were people close to him.
Then why did he trust them to investigate election fraud?
Who were telling him that they had proof that there was fraud in the election. There were a lot of people who were making that argument both publicly and privately to him.
But without any evidence.
If you know anything about Donald Trump, that his inability to believe that he actually lost, that the American people had actually rejected him, and that the Democrats and the U.S. security state and the deep state, something he had spent years complaining about, and that you yourself even said were in fact aligned against him, the fact that Donald Trump would actually, under those circumstances, come to conclude that he didn't really lose, but in fact was the victim of fraud, is something that is very easy for me to believe was true. And I think what Darren Beatty said is right on, that almost every person who knows Trump that I've ever talked to, even ones who believe that the election fraud claims are bullshit, were convinced that he was authentic in his belief that that election was stolen.
So what evidence would it take to show you otherwise, to convince you otherwise?
I mean, ultimately, there's no proof one way or the other about what's going on in somebody's brain. All we can use is circumstantial evidence.
Correct. So I'm asking what circumstantial evidence, yes.
Yeah, I think that the fact that there were people telling him in his ear that he did not actually lose the election, the way in which he's psychologically constituted, the way that he is talked so many times about both the Democratic Party and the U.S. establishment, the fact that he maintains to this very day that the election was stolen, even though that a majority of Americans don't actually agree with him on this, the lengths to which he went, the way in which he argues it, the fact that a lot of people believe in the Republican Party, in fact, I think a majority, that there was actually election fraud, all to me point to the fact that when you put that together with Trump's psychological incentives to believe that he didn't really lose, it's far more likely than not that he truly was convinced that there was sufficient fraud in the election that made him the legitimate winner.
So there's no piece of evidence, because everything you're saying is also...
By the way, best case scenario here, Trump's deluded and will never take a loss, just to be clear. Trump's best case scenario, Trump's deluded, will never take a loss, and is willing to overthrow everything, including the Constitution, at least publicly claimed to be willing to do that, in order to keep that deluded hold on power. The belief that he can never lose. If that's best case scenario for Trump, that's pretty bleak.
Consistent with him just wanting to stay in power.
There's no such thing as dispositive proof when it comes to understanding what's in somebody's brain.
Okay, I don't know why you keep saying that. How do we get convictions where mens rea is an essential part of the crime? Like for first degree murder, we have to know that you intended to murder somebody, which is manslaughter, right? Glenn, we read people's states of mind all the time for criminal court.
I'm realizing now that you don't understand the difference between evidence and proof. Proof is something that is dispositive. So if someone steals something and they're caught on a videotape stealing it, then you have dispositive proof that they've done so. Usually in criminal cases, there's not proof, there's evidence, and the evidence is often conflicting, and a jury has to decide how to resolve that conflicting evidence. And that's why in a civil trial, they're told they have to believe just 51% or more in order to reach a verdict, whereas in a criminal trial, they have to believe beyond all reasonable doubt. But the way that works is you present evidence of intent. There's very rarely proof of intent.
Sure,
which
I'm
is
sorry.
the thing that you're looking
when
for.
I'm asking you for...
You don't have it either.
Yeah, you're right. You cannot prove 100%. That's true.
Exactly.
What I'm asking is, what is the types of evidence that would move you over into thinking, oh, he was probably just trying to hold on to power? Oh, and actually, I think I did say evidence, by the way. But what is the evidence that would convince you that, oh, you know, there's not one piece of dispositive thing, not a written confession or a travel to the past?
If Trump had said to people who convincingly relate it, oh, you know what, I actually think I really lost this election.
So you need a confession.
No way I'm going to let No, you're asking me for examples of things that I would find convincing, and I'm giving those to you.
Besides a confession, obviously.
Well, that's one good way. Another good way is if he had nobody around him who was believing or arguing that there was evidence of fraud, that he was just kind of, as you were trying to...
That's not going to be the same. There's always going to be a kiss ass who, definitely when you talk about someone like Donald Trump, who's in the room, that's going to say, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir.
To claim I was on an island all by myself.
Has there ever been a time where Trump's been only surrounded by people who disagree with him outside of a foreign visit?
Myself, if he had actually nobody that he was around him or that he trusted telling him that there was proof of fraud or strong evidence of fraud, even though you had Rudy Giuliani and other people telling him that they strongly believed there was, I think that would add to the belief, to the credible case that Trump was saying there was fraud, even though he really didn't believe it. None of those things actually happened, though. None of those things is true. And so you're asking me to say what my belief is based on the body of evidence that I have, all of which I've described for you and laid out in great detail over the last 5 minutes, that leads me to believe very strongly, while recognizing there's no proof, that Trump believed the election was fraudulent.
So to be clear,
can you just do your final point here, because I feel like we're just going.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm good. I'll just respond to that final point. I don't have any more questions. To be clear, you haven't laid out any strong evidence showing that Donald Trump sincerely believes, other than this idea. Other than this idea, I'm not declaring something. Other than this idea that Trump has this. That Trump has this psychotic attention. Well, the American voters are going to decide. The Supreme Court's going to decide. All sorts of people are going to be deciding a whole bunch of things. But this idea.
We should participate in a debate, but this need that you have to constantly say, I'm on an island, nobody agrees with me, you're right, I have no evidence. Just let people watch the debate.
They can do it, but I think it's important to call out.
People will understand that.
You have not laid.
If somebody enters a conversation and can't acknowledge that the Whiskey Rebellion was an insurrection because of how fucking asinine their definition of insurrection is, I think citing historians perfectly appropriate. Saying, yeah, I don't think I know of any historian who agrees with this. But I will also say that then I do stand by my statement to Destiny about the legality of annexation of the Golan Heights, and that no international law scholar is going to agree with that unless they're walking back from their conclusion.
I just don't
factually
feel any need
compelling
to say
arguments.
that.
Nothing
I
that
don't
you
think
say
you
is
have either.
factual.
Okay, well,
I have.
well,
I can
think-
point to exact things. For instance, that Raffensperger call that you brought up earlier.
I'm
Oh,
not
was he looking for
interested in debating the
11,000
debate with
votes?
you. I'm
Yeah, I
not-
know you don't want to
I'm
debate on the
very-
facts. You want to talk about
I'm
the fact
very-
that they're
I'm very-
partisan and the courts
We've
were
gone for-
Democrats.
we've gone-
And
there's
Pelosi
no-
was the
there's
first one to
no
put together a
partisan-
partisan body.
Okay,
Wait a
I'm
second.
done. This is not
No.
interesting
Wait,
or helpful.
yeah,
I'm above
Thanks,
this. Go
Glenn.
ahead.
Yeah,
Have fun.
Glenn, Destiny, I think that's the best time to finish off. Thanks both for responding. Actually, it was around half an hour ago. I think it was actually around 34 minutes ago. I wrote down the time because you actually both agreed with each other, so I was very proud of that moment 34 minutes ago. But aside from that, I think overall it was good debate with some heated moments, and thank you both for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Destiny, for doing it. Thank you, Eli, for moderating. You did a great job.
No, thank you. No,
Yep.
no problem. Thanks so
All
much.
right, good night.
Good night.
Glenn does not look happy. Glenn did not look happy. Am I the only one who looked at that and was like, that did not look like a happy pants Glenn? He did not look happy. Man, I thought Glenn would do better, but I also wanted this type of a conversation like this so we could have the moments where Destiny's like, wait, let's go back. Let's talk about the definition for insurrection. Wait, let's go back. Let's center back on this. He was able to do that a lot more here. And even though they repeated kind of the same talks again and again and again, that's also due to the fact that Destiny kept recentering the conversation. And the host, I got to give credit to Eli a little bit, recentering the conversation. I like Eli as a moderator, so vaguely, most, I think. There's like a few things. I'd maybe be slightly more aggressive with moderation. I think Destiny did pretty well. I think Destiny did better than I expected. And he even made some arguments or incorporated some evidence in a way that I hadn't seen before. This is probably one of his better performances, generally. Glenn was, and it wasn't due to a lack of effort from Glenn either. I think this was Glenn pulling all the stops. I really do think this was Glenn pulling all the stops here. Man, where does Destiny even go from here? And if you want to debate anyone else on this topic? I don't know who else, unless he wanted to debate the actual J6 lawyers. QAnon shaman? I don't know.